Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. Alexander the Great, the first Byzantine emperor. If you're familiar with both Alexander the Great and Byzantium, this title may at first appear absurd, especially if you take my meaning literally. Alexander died in the 320s BC, and what some people consider Byzantium started at the very earliest with Diocletian and Constantine some 600 years later. This is a conceptual rabbit hole I prepared this evening, one I've studied over the years, and it has reaped dividends for me at least. Indeed, it may be one of the most intellectually consequential pursuits I've ever undertaken, historically speaking. The concept's significance first occurred to me when reading R.G. Collingwood's Idea of History, where Collingwood identifies Alexander's conquest as opening up mental horizons of the Greeks to conceive of histories spanning of the whole of mankind. Central to this is the Greek idea of Homonoia, which also happens to be a Greek goddess, meaning the union of hearts, which carried over into future eras as concord or harmony. Concord to the Romans is a forerunner to the idea of Christendom, and if you extrapolate that even further, remove it from religious connotations, the unity of nations, and the idea of world peace. Alexander was not the first to impose a world peace. He inherited the mantle of King of Kings from Cyrus the Great of Persia, but he Hellenized it. Byzantium is a post hoc concept, true. No one ever self-identified in the Byzantine Empire as a Byzantine. If it signifies anything, it has to mean a universal, Graecified, Roman, Christian polity or empire. If I were to add my own caveat, which I do often, it would be an orientalized empire, one that is placed in direct opposition to a Western polity or empire. To the successors of Alexander, this was Rome. To Byzantium, it was the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. As Byzantium is a concept, something that exists in the minds of historians, I'm invested in testing this concept to its possible limits. When reading the Greek Alexander romance for the first time, I was struck by this segment in it. When the foundations for most of the city of Alexandria had been laid and measured, Alexander inscribed 5 letters, A, B, G, D, E, and of course for the translation, these are Latin letters. A for Alexander, B for Basileus, king, G for Genos, meaning descendant, D for Dios, meaning Zeus, and E for Eketsin, founded an incomparable city. The title emperor or even Caesar would eventually fall into abeyance in Byzantium. For Alexander and his title of Basileus would be appropriated by them. In his lifetime, Alexander transformed the Macedonian idea of kingship into a Persianized, Babylonian, and even Egyptian form of kingship, one could say mirroring Diocletian's transformation of the Roman Empire from a principate, where he was first citizen of the Republic, into dominate, to be Deus, Dominus et Deus, master and God. Indeed, substitute Zeus for God, and you could have Constantine inscribing a motto for his new city of Constantinople. What diminishes and distinguishes Byzantium from Alexander is Christianity. Alexander was a pagan and a god, as Diocletian was. As Caesar would claim to be a descendant of Venus, as Alexander was of Zeus and of the pharaohs. The entire Christian world had to reckon with this legacy of Alexander. Alexander, like Joan of Arc, who I've covered extensively on this channel, is one of these characters whose semi-mythological status leaves me interrogating the legacies that surround them as much, if not more, than the people themselves. Despite being a pagan, Alexander was broadly considered as anticipating the Roman and even Christian rule over Europe. As Bossuet and Filmer would claim, of the Jewish David and Solomon as archetypes for Christian kings into the 17th century, the case was made for Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors. Dante, paraphrasing Lucan and Pharsalia, argued that it was Rome that completed Alexander's near achievement of pre-Christian universal monarchy. For Josephus and the Christian apologetics, Alexander was comparable to Cyrus in his relationship to the Jews as this great Gentile intercessor into Jewish history. Alexandria, as the sacred city, was a precursor to Constantinople and is a component of the Pentarchy, the 5 holy cities of the bishops, the episcopal seats of Christendom, alongside with Antioch, another city that was founded by a successor of Alexander the Great, and where Christians first identified. Furthermore, I've drawn some more esoteric connections. The Roman Empire began with Augustus and his defeat of Cleopatra, the last descendant of Alexander, and with her death, the Roman conquest of Ptolemaic Egypt, which technically made Augustus a pharaoh. The Holy Roman Empire began to contest the legitimacy of the Eastern Roman Empire when Irene was made a female Basileus, another strong conceptual contender as the first Byzantine emperor in her own right. This point of Byzantine inception identifies a return to Greece, Greeks to Romans and Romans to Romaioi, as if the division of East and West, Greeks and Romans in the 3rd century BC was once again alive in the 9th century AD. Yet if there is a crux for this conversation, it will revolve around these notions where Alexander centers Hellenes and barbarians, and one where he will prefigure pagans and Christians. Now, thank you very much, Alexandra, for being very patient and listening to all that. I'm very happy to have you on again to discuss some more niche esoteric conceptual history. Hello, how are you doing this evening?
Hello to you and to everybody, to our listeners. I'm doing quite well. I had quite a rough day, as you know, so I would like to apologize preemptively if I will not be so sharp tonight, but I'm very happy to be here, and this is a topic that I find immensely fascinating, especially because I had many thoughts myself about Alexander the Great, which is I would say an emblematic figure in my own life. Just as a small anecdote, my name Ruxandra, my dad gave me this name because of Alexander the Great. So I basically grew up thinking about and reading about Alexander the Great and his feats. So it's almost like a familiar figure. Despite not having read much in the past years, I got to do quite an amazing project. I got to illustrate a novel about him, and I just finished not long ago. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I know there's going to be a lot of bibliography and a lot of really dense information and exchange of thoughts.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the family history. I have a rather sort of more mundane anecdote, which is that my father is named Alexander, not because he was named after Alexander the Great, just because being part Scottish, Alexander is quite a popular name, kings of Scotland, etc. But of course, he had to name his first ever car Bucephalus. Anyway, on that
That's
note,
great.
I'm wary again of considerations for the level of knowledge that the audience has coming into this. So before I get into the secondary literature and the heavier stuff, I thought it'd be really conducive to just give you everyone a brief overview about Alexander's life. For reference, in preparation for this, Arrian is the sort of go-to source for this, classical source for this. I read Plutarch in preparation for this. There are many other authors, but nevertheless, and many others that we'll be covering in terms of their interpretations. But to put this very bluntly, Alexander is the son, a very contested element, it should be mentioned, of King Philip of Macedon. His whole notion of paternity and his relationship to his mother Olympias and Olympias's relationship with Philip is actually going to be something which has a major bearing on the conversation going forward in terms of his perception and his legacy. But nevertheless, Plutarch mentions very interesting things about the mentality of Alexander growing up. Is that Philip is known for expanding the northern Macedonian kingdom, which is around the city of Thessaloniki, which literally means friend of the Thessalonians. One of Philip's great political achievements was in unifying northern Macedonia with Thessaly, thereby allowing the Macedonians to come further south into Greece, bordering Attica and the many great sort of city leagues that we have after the Peloponnesian Wars. You can say that Greek civilization has sort of entered into a bit of a crisis after the great wars between Athens and Sparta, And so this semi-barbarian king, according to many of the more, again, sort of Athenian-centered cosmopolitan Politean Greeks in the south consider him, is arriving to declare his lordship over all of Greece, or hegemony over all the Greeks. But Alexander is looking at this and the creation of a very strong army, which is going to be the bedrock of his campaigns, and thinking, well, I would rather be the inheritor of a weak kingdom or a tumultuous legacy in order that I can prove my worth through these great acts of deed. And that whole notion, again, of him having to demonstrate his various noble, you can even say godlike virtues in his almost impossible series of conquests, we see is going to be a recurring theme, and that possibly aiding, you can say, to the interpretation of madness that we see towards the end. But Philip is assassinated. Perhaps you'll be interested to talk about the sort of elements there. He goes on to lead the Macedonian Greek forces in a series of great battles, notably the Battle of Issus, where he nearly captures Darius, the emperor of the Persians. For reference, again, for people who don't know, the Persians had attacked Greece on many occasions, most notably Darius, the Battle of Marathon, Xerxes, the Battle of Thermopylae, to which he was ultimately victorious in that battle, but defeated in that overall campaign despite burning Athens. And so the great culmination of this centuries-long feud between the Greeks and the Persians is to have a Macedonian king come over and attempt to conquer the Persian Empire. He is able to conquer the country of Egypt, where he's seen as a liberator. He's able to conquer the great island city of Tyre. He then goes east and fights Darius, the Battle of Gaugamela. But I've been talking for some time regarding these very, very sort of brief points regarding Alexander. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up in the interim, Roxandra?
Oh no, this is a great introduction into Alexander, and of course it's we're talking about, and I think I say that with full confidence, one of the most exceptional personalities in recorded history, because all his feats happened over a course of maybe at maximum 12 years in record time. And Alexander's historical feats are equally as important as the mythology he left behind, or the symbolism he left behind, because you spoke about his family background, which is also very important. The disputed part of Philip II being his father was that I think his mother, Olympias, claimed that Zeus was his actual father. So it's interesting. So the dynasty from which he stems is the Argead dynasty. And you will find, when you look at the Macedonian history, you'll find the beautiful shield with an abstracted sun figure, which is the symbol of the Argeadic dynasty. And his mother was from an Epirot royal house, so a Molossian tribe. Some people think they're related to Thracians. And she was one of the main figures in the shadow that probably influenced Alexander in a way probably more profound than his father in some regards. She was a very mysterious woman with a very strong will, probably a greed for power, very intelligent as well. And she was involved in different cults, Chthonic cults that she brought into the Argead house. There's also like a claim of descendancy from Heracles, from his father's line. And that is also very important because in the formation or education of Alexander, what he became later on is this mythology that he assumed and assimilated, and he was really aware of it. And throughout his military campaigns, he performed several, let's say, rituals or interesting acts that were reminiscent of his genealogy, thinking about Zeus's father in Egypt, bringing offerings at the altar of Heracles in Tyre, because that's also related to Heraclean history. And also what I would like to say from the beginning, without dragging this conversation too long, is that when Alexander came to power and he spread Greek culture from the Mediterranean basin to Hindu Kush, it's the period that we know as Hellenistic period. It's following right after the classical Greek period, which peaked under Pericles. And it's a crystallization of a lot of philosophical concepts and thoughts that became a very solid crystallized culture, which lasted for a long time and translated into the Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which is de facto Roman Empire. We could talk about that later on. So it's very interesting that the mythological part, it actually played a very important role in practice. And it was the main drive for his courage and his conquest.
Well, as we'll see later with the Alexander Romance, there's an even more sort of esoteric reading behind his lineage. But of course, the converse, you can say the issue of Olympias bringing these more Chthonic elements of cult worship, in particular her snake worship, into the Macedonian court, is the idea of Alexander's illegitimacy. And this leads to a situation, you could say, which actually helps bring about Philip's death, which is his desire to have another wife and potentially, again, a legitimate scion, which is actually something that the uncle of one of his wives, Cleopatra, directly alluded to Alexander being illegitimate. And it leads to one of these famous incidences in Alexander's earlier life where there's about to be a fight breaking out in the court. Philip rises up again to try and defend his position, but he's so drunk he staggers over, and Alexander is supposed to have remarked, how can you go off and defeat the Persians where you could barely stand, or words to that sort of effect. So in terms of all these, almost fantastical conquests, after the Battle of Gaugamela, it's very obvious that Alexander, it would seem, has conquered the known world, as the Greeks at least perceived it at that time, which is around the year 330 BC. But following Gaugamela, he's now interested in the idea of creating a new empire, and that involves taking many of the Persian elites, in addition to taking the Greek elites who have come with him, and placing them in charge of all these various provinces that they've now conquered, or satrapies. He desperately wants Darius, the last Achaemenid king of kings, the dynasty that Cyrus belonged to be one of these satrapies. But alas, he evades Alexander, is ultimately betrayed by his own men. And this leads to a situation where you have a series of controversial events regarding Alexander's reign, where he begins trying to intermingle the Hellenistic and quote-unquote barbarian cultures. I'll get much more into that later on. He begins to effect a midway between Macedonian kingship, which was based much more on popular sovereignty. Even if you go to somewhere like Sparta and the Constitution of Lycurgus, the Spartan constitution is much closer to the Roman Republic than it is to an idea of orientalized kingship, and the whole notion of the Greeks as having liberty and rights, ignoring, of course, the vast numbers of slaves in the Greek cities, but that's neither here nor there. We begin to see a series of conspiracies, such as involving one of his most preeminent generals, Parmenio. Then he leads an expedition into India against King Porus, which has very mixed results. In the end, there's a mutiny by his own men, which forces Alexander to come back and deal with the issues of governing in the principal cities of the Persian Empire, in Babylon, in Susa. But of course, one of the great capitals of the Persian Empire, Persepolis, is burnt by the forces of Alexander. Again, like the issue regarding the assassination of Philip, where we can allude to the idea that Olympias has something involved, or maybe even Alexander himself, people contest, had something to do with his father's assassination. We don't know whether Persepolis was burned as a result of an accident or as a result of intentional sabotage by someone like Alexander. In fact, what I find very interesting is that all of these major questions regarding not just the historical record, but how this would reflect on Alexander's character, are still open to speculation. Including his own death, when he finally dies after you mentioned that spectacular, very brief 12-year reign. Is it primarily as a result of the injuries he sustained during war, including a quite serious series of injuries in his Indian campaign, or is it a result of his own sort of excesses and overdrinking? Given the fact that Alexander, a large part of what drove him, again, was a part of it, you could say, was abstentionism, the desire to be master of himself in order to assume the role of divine kingship, which he wanted essentially to present to the world. how could he essentially follow in the manner of his father, King Philip, and send himself to a very early grave? And in the process, another lingering question is the idea of succession. Whether Alexander ever planned a serious succession, he did have a son, it should be mentioned, through his wife Roxana, which itself was a quite dubious political match in terms of her being this rather distant Bactrian princess, and what political sort of opportunities would be afforded by that marriage, especially when his Greek generals wanted to have a Greek match to complement that. It was all about the idea of Alexander becoming a more sort of barbarian ruler. The fact that he died early meant that his son had, again, a questionable legitimacy to him, and he was ultimately the victim of the wars of the Diadochi, all the successors going forward. And then you have more apocryphal statements about the idea that he said, "I will will my empire to the strongest," which actually would be consistent with some elements of Alexander's character. But again, that would be a damning legacy in terms of him almost willing a situation of the Darwinian sort of and a sort of Nietzschean sort of will to power and that sort of thing to determine the fate of the empire as he had won it by conquest. And then, of course, there is the meta point regarding this conversation, in that if he truly willed his conquest to the strongest, who ultimately proved to be the strongest in the long run, it would, of course, be the Roman Empire. But any thoughts on just that very, very brief and unsatisfactory summary I've given there, Roxandra?
No, it's more than satisfactory, and I think it's also very important to understand the person of Alexander. It's really fascinating. I was not long ago, I was having a conversation, I think it was with my dad, about the psychological patterns in Alexander. And you see, I always thought that there's this very interesting similarity between Alexander and King David from the Bible. There's this choleric personality type, because he could be capable of, first of all, he was a highly educated individual. He had precocious intelligence. I think we can make that assumption. He had great qualities as a leader. He could make himself beloved by people very easily. Ever since he was young, he could be left alone at the court and entertain diplomatic corps from Athens. He was known to be able to have very complex conversations with people. But he was also very excessive and compulsive. And I think that has a lot to do with the toxic family environment. Also his father's marriages, which were probably the source of the discordia in the family, and his mother's jealousy, and his mother trying to manipulate him against his own father. And she put that seed of the greed for power. I think probably it was there already, but his mother really ignited that fire. But we have David in the Bible. He was very much the same way, because he was also very impulsive. We know he committed acts that are hard to believe. They're somewhat irreconcilable with somebody who's beloved by God, who wrote the Psalms. He killed Uriah for a woman. He had several wives. He would have these moments of great anger, but they were both very wise. They were able of great acts of magnanimity and depth of spirit. And it's very interesting as a symbol. I hope I'm not dragging the conversation elsewhere right now, but it's very interesting. There's almost an identical situation. And I think it's worth to mention in the beginning, because later on it's probably going to be more technical. But we have in 2 Samuel, also in 1 Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken, when the Philistines occupied Bethlehem and the city is under siege, and David is hiding in the cave of Adullam, and he's having this moment. He's probably speaking outside of himself. Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, that is by the gate. And so 3 of his warriors, they risk their lives. They bring him water. And when they bring him the water, David feels incredible shame, and he pours out the water. He says, "How could I drink the blood of men who risk their lives for me?" Something like that. And in the Gedrosian desert, in the Indian campaign in the Far East with Alexander, the army is suffering immensely from thirst and dehydration. And something similar happens. Some soldiers find a little bit of water somewhere. They put it in a helmet and they bring it to Alexander. And Alexander does exactly the same thing. He pours out the water. And he says something very similar. How could I do such a thing when we either all die or all enjoy water? We go through this together. And it's interesting because there are several episodes in Alexander's life that seem biblical almost. And of course, we could talk about Josephus, but it's a fascinating character. And I think it's very important that one understands the exceptional qualities of Alexander, not just the excesses and vices. It's a really fascinating, contradictory, paradoxical personality, I think. And paradoxes are quite humane, but they're expressed quite strongly in his persona.
Well, regarding those paradoxes, in terms of his personal heroism and the emphasis on him enduring and going beyond, again, not just his ability as a general, as a strategist, but also as a soldier, it's not only that he is going to be on the front lines, in many cases he is leading from the vanguard. One of the remarkable things about his cavalry charges is that he will often charge straight at any gaps that are presented in the Persian line, darting straight forward to Darius's chariot. The later Roman generals will see this as tantamount to suicide, but again, you can see this as the sort of divinely possessed Alexander that, if he is slain in battle, then of course, his campaign wasn't willed about as a result of providence, but if it is, he will ensure that all of these calamities may befall him in order to achieve his goal, which is the conquest of the world by right of conquest. But that whole allusion to the Gedrosian desert, there's a darker undercurrent to that, which of course, on the one hand, he is deliberately suffering the privations of his troops, yet the interpretation is that he forced his troops to march through the Gedrosian desert through as a result of their mutiny in the first place. So you can read many contradictory sort of elements that, yes, there is an element of humility in the form of Alexander in his preparedness to deal with the extreme risk to himself, yet and also a huge amount of animosity directed at those towards him, such as his relationship with Hephaestion and how he will adore him. Part of the sort of elements of madness is when he eventually dies, but of course he's not above completely berating him and doing what Napoleon would later do, which is your entire career you owe to me. Regarding sort of how to bring this conversation forward, one text I've decided to dedicate a whole segment to is the Greek Alexander Romance. The reason being, it's one of these sources which has the most dubious of provenances, and I'll get into the provenance of the source in a bit, but it's the universal application of it, and it's how it's interpreted into so many different languages, and how there's a direct parallel between Alexander in the 4th century BC, Alexander's link to Rome, and you can say various Christian allusions which are presented in the mythical life of Alexander. And just on the notion of Rome, it's just quite funny reading about this in the Romance. This is a segment taken from it. Alexander, this is apparently just after his coronation, went out to conquer Rome. Nearby envoys from all nations went out to meet him and prostrate themselves before him, bringing him gifts of gold and silver, which were without number, and all agreed to an alliance with him. And presently he conquered Rome, and the Romans went out to meet him with their choruses and drums, holding branches of laurel in their hands. And they approached Alexander as a king and proclaimed him ruler of the world. Going to the city, he went off to the Capitolium of Zeus, and the priests received him, and he was entertained as a guest by him. While they were staying in Rome, behold, Laomedon, who drove the chariot with him, came with 50,000 men for an alliance with Alexander, brought gifts in gold and stone pearls. Alexander received him and welcomed him sincerely and said, "Noble sir, you have come to be my ally as I fight with Darius." So he left Rome and marched against the regions of the west, and no one opposed him. And again, we can look at that, and a lot of historians of antiquity have been sort of, what on earth is this referencing? The closest example we have is in terms of the presentation of the laurel wreaths, which some have interpreted basically as a diplomatic gesture by the Romans. But again, it has rather sort of strange implications in terms of the Roman usages of laurels, and the whole notion of bestowing a triumph on a foreigner, etc. But the point is, this is then further augmented by an element whereby once Alexander is dying in some of the traditions of the Romance, he receives the capitulation of the Roman Empire, which would by extent mean that Alexander had conquered Rome. But of course, as we see with figures like Dante, that would be very easy to conjure up this sort of Greek sort of hyper-nationalism where Rome was conquered before the Romans would ultimately conquer the Greeks. But the reason, again, I'm mentioning this is because of the application and the provenance. In particular, I'm reading, it should be mentioned, the Stoneman Greek translation, but there's also the Armenian Romance of Alexander. There's the Syriac Romance of Alexander. There are, of course, Latin and French romances. There's also a Mongolian romance.
Armenian folklore. Sorry for interrupting you. It's fascinating how vast this current in literature is.
But there's also a Mongolian romance. So of course, when Genghis Khan and his successors were involved in the conquest of much of Alexander's empire in the 13th century, of course they deliberately wanted to imitate that legacy and imbibe parts of the history, and they themselves were actually receiving many of the old manuscripts that were the very interesting implications in terms of Alexander the Great's legacy going forward, but very much they were covering the same ground just from a different tradition. But in terms of relating this back to Byzantium, the Byzantines were very interested in all of these collections. Of course, there is this Armenian, Syriac, Greek confluence in the fact that the Byzantine Empire invariably controlled these territories. In fact, various emperors were Armenian. But it's the fact, again, why they chose to preserve these various manuscripts. The best iterations we have are from the 11th century going forwards. I was reading an article by one Dr. Stephen Gero, where he believes that one of the incentives for the Byzantines to take such a great interest in the romance and the folklore was in particular that they wanted to pit this within the context of the iconoclastic controversy within Byzantium, which was this huge religious controversy in the 8th century, where the emperor decided to suppress and in many cases destroy religious iconography throughout the empire. The mainstream interpretation is to actually imitate the Arabs who he had just defeated at the Siege of Constantinople. And so much of the interest in Alexander is actually talking about his fair and wise religious policy towards the pagans. In other words, he would be some sort of forerunner for an iconodual perspective, though at least that's interpretation. But this comes back to the Greek romance's interpretation of Alexander's birth, because you've alluded to the Zeus and the Hercules myth, but this is the more esoteric myth. It's the Nectanebo, the Zeus Ammon myth regarding presaging his conquest and his position as pharaoh of Egypt. And again, this is taken from the Greek romance. Many say that Alexander was the son of King Philip, but they are deceivers. This is untrue. He was not Philip's son, but the wisest of the Egyptians say that he was the son of Nectanebo, after the latter had fallen from his royal estate. This king who has fled will return to Egypt, not as an old man, but as a youth, and he will overcome our enemies, the Persians. They asked one another what the meaning of this saying might be, but finding no answer, they wrote down to the oracle that had been given to them on a pedestal the statue of Nectanebo. Nectanebo soon became a familiar figure to everyone in Macedonia. King Philip happened to be childless by his wife Olympias, and as he was going to be away for a war for a long time, he called her to him and said, "Take note of this. If you do not bear me a son after I return from the war, you shall never know my embrace again." When the day ended, Philip went off to war with his entire army. One of Olympias' servants, realizing why her mistress was so sad, said to her, "Lady, I have some things to tell you. I will say it, if you will not hold it against me." "Speak," replied the queen. "I shall not hold it against you. If it is what I want to hear, I shall certainly owe you my thanks." Then the maid went on, "There is in the city a man from Egypt who is able to fulfill everything that the soul desires, if you will only allow him to see you. Olympias did not hesitate, but sent for him right away and ordered him to come in to her. When Necténabo saw her, he began to lust after her beauty. He held out his hand and said, "Greetings, Queen of the Macedonians." "Greeting to you too, most excellent prophet," she replied. "Come and sit down. You are the Egyptian teacher, in whom those who have tried you have found nothing but truth. I too was persuaded by you. What art of prophecy do you use to foretell the truth?" "There are many and diverse methods of prophecy, O Queen," he replied. "One may interpret horoscopes, signs, dreams, or may utter oracles from the belly of prophecy or the feast of a lamb. And they are casters of nativities and the so-called magi, who are the masters of prophecy." So saying, he gave Olympias a sharp look. "Prophet," she said to him, "have you turned to stone as you look to me?" "Yes, madam," he replied, "for I remembered an oracle given to me by my own gods. You must prophesy to a queen, and see, it has come true. So tell me what you wish." Then he placed his hand in a fold of her garment and took out an extraordinary little writing tablet constructed from gold, ivory, ebony, silver, and engraved with 3 zones. Olympias was full of wonder at the precious object. She ordered everyone to go away, sat down beside him and said, "Prophet, cast a nativity for myself and Philip." He replied, "You must have intercourse with an incarnate God, become pregnant by him, bear his son and bring him up. He will be the avenger of the wrongs Philip has done to you. And who is this God? Ammon of Libya." Then Olympias asked him, "What form does this God take?" "He is a man of middle-aged, with hair and beard of gold and horns growing from his forehead of gold." That should be quite interesting in terms of the references to Daniel that we're going to see. And just again, in terms of this interpretation, the reason this whole sort of myth around Ammon Zeus and Necténabo is alluded to. Remember the device I used at the beginning. It's not just a matter of being a god, it's a matter of being a descendant, in this case, a descendant of the Egyptian pharaohs, who are themselves divine. The whole idea is that so much of the folklore regarding Alexander, especially in Ptolemaic Egypt, where his legacy was essentially allowed to, you can say not necessarily the legacy, but the propaganda around him sort of went into fever pitch, is this idea that the Greeks, and by extension Alexander, were liberators against the Persians, who were the descendants of Cambyses and all of his, again, purported excesses. So that's a very interesting imitation in terms that his birth is deliberately willing him to not the conquest of Persia, but the liberation of Egypt.
It's interesting. I think I misheard from the beginning the quotation that you read. Was it from the later sources, like the Alexander Romance? Because this is not in the, let's say, the primary Plutarch or Arian source regarding
regarding the Alexander Romance. In Plutarch and Arian we have the.
Talking about the true father of Alexandria, and where the
yes, we have in Arian we have, was it the Anabasis?
Yes.
In Plutarch, of course, we have Plutarch's lives, the Greek lives, the Roman lives. This, again, in terms of the origin of the Romance, I've already sort of alluded to the provenance of it in terms of it being a collection of various folklores and stories that were compiled during the time of the Byzantine Empire. And like I said, the manuscripts for this exist around the time of the 11th century. But in terms of any sort of authorship, the allusion is to someone called the Pseudo-Callisthenes, who, again, apparently was supposed to be a contemporary of Alexander the Great. But in terms of academic consensus regarding the origins of the Romance in particular, is that this actually comes from around the time of Constantine. So I find it very interesting that all of these myths and folklores regarding Alexander the Great, as far as the conversation regarding Byzantium is concerned, are being recompiled and preserved around the time of the formation of the Christian Roman Empire. So another time you can say where there's this great investment in the Romance is around the time of the Emperor Justinian, who, it should be mentioned again for a bit of extra context, his main political goal is the renovation of the empire, in other words, to reclaim the lost provinces. And of course, a renewed popular interest in Alexander the Great would seem to go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking, but this is an inconsequential contribution in many ways about the potentiality of Alexander being actually a bastard, not being the son of Philip II. I think this is like later speculations, because I think it was, it's not, I don't think we have reasons to think that he was not the son of Philip II in that regard. And the descendancy from Zeus, I think it was also inoculated by Olympias before the visit in Egypt. I think it was on, I forget, I think it was in 331. The association with the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. So I was just thinking about when you mentioned that part, if it was from later sources. But it's also very interesting to, since we talked about Iliade in our previous podcast, how especially great historical feats, but also like mundane events, especially in a culture that is archaic, they become myth very easily, like in less than a generation time. So I think one of the problems with Alexander is that he didn't really have really good scribes that would write according, let's say, to modern historical methods, every single thing that happened on a daily basis, to keep like a day book of his campaign. We do have good, reliable sources, but it's a shame that I feel like this is one of the vulnerabilities of Alexander the Great's, let's say, empire, that it wasn't documented as well as we would like to have been. And yeah, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, because you mentioned Justinian, and it's a long connection there.
If it's not clear, again, sort of the investment and the overall sort of focus on this topic is on the historical meta. So this isn't a history. This is a synthesis of folklore with a dubious provenance. The reason being is that this story in particular would be the legitimating story for the Ptolemies. And in that case, it's incredibly significant as a piece of, you can derisively say it's a bit of a mythological legerdemain, but ultimately, in terms of the myth making around Alexander, it's actually quite essential in terms of being able to understand so much of the history and the continuity going from the empire into Rome, which is very much the focus of the conversation. So, for example, the whole idea of the god coming forward with the horns, in particular the horned god, seems to almost be prefigured in order to coincide with the prophecy of Daniel. So it seems that all of these elements were creeping into later folklore and accounts in terms of being able to, I'm not going to necessarily say deliberately pervert the work, but there's certainly a Byzantine element which is coming forward in the later interpretations of him.
And in any regard, I'm sorry, general theology does agree that there's prophecies about Alexander, specifically in Daniel, but I think I have to check which chapter exactly it is. But we have numerous references.
Yes, if I recall, it's, well, I've got another segment dedicated for it a little later on. It's Daniel 8:21 is a specific segment I'm going to be bringing up later. But again, this is sort of all significant because it's about trying to find some sort of mythological anticipation for his various deeds. So the story is just, again, littered with various allusions. So Alexander references this story and that of Nectanebo as the story of a second Aeneas, again, Aeneas relating back to the Aeneid, Virgil relating back to Rome's foundation and the origin of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We have references to the birth of Heraclius. We have references to Alexander being Odysseus in terms of trying to drive away his father's future sort of wives, etc., as in the example of Cleopatra and her brother Lysias. And we have completely fictive events. All of these points, some of it is interesting, chimes up with Plutarch's account and various historical records, and some of it goes into complete fantasy. And I'm interested in the fantasy in terms of the various allusions you can bring to other sort of mythological characters that we have around this time, but also more sort of broad notions in comparison to the scriptures, of which there are many. So the romance then goes on to say that Alexander had a vision of Zeus Ammon during, again, a completely fictitious expedition to Libya, but it's quite interesting to read. O king, thus Phoebus of the ram's horn says to you, if you wish to bloom forever in incorruptible youth, found the city rich in fame opposite the Isle of Proteus, where Aeon Plutonius himself is enthroned as king. He, from his 5-peaked mountain, rolls round the endless world. Proteus Island, of course, is the Pharos Island. In fact, it's quite interesting then in terms of the foundation of Alexandria as a city, the city of kind of like Rome, the city of august augury, which is the origin, inception of the revitalization of the name of the Augustus. That Pharos was intended to be the entire city before someone pointed out it was far too small. And nowadays it sort of forms a bit of a peninsula coming out of the modern city of Alexandria. But again, Alexandria, during this expedition, apparently visits obelisks in Egypt of the king Sesankosis. And I wonder if this is a very early allusion to what Shelley would refer to as Ozymandias. Here lies Ozymandias, king of kings, and this fires up in Alexander the idea of a world empire in the form that there was a world king associated with one god in particular, which is Serapis. Serapis is this Greco-Egyptian god combining various cults of various gods. Essentially, we have Zeus Ammon on the one hand, which is Alexander's god, but Serapis essentially becomes the Ptolemaic progenitor, and of course there are allusions to snakes with Serapis, which come back to Olympias. So the whole point again with all of these allusions is that within the mind of the Ptolemies and within the minds of the Romans going forward again, we're talking again sort of before the period of official histories and you can say scientific accounts for biographies, etc. But again, I'm very interested in terms of the various interpretations that these particular contemporaries and rulers had at the time in ways of being able to interpret someone like Alexander. Like I said, the meta role regarding the legacy sort of completely obscuring the historical character, and this in particular comes to Serapis and the romance and his particular vision regarding the foundation of the city of Constantine, of Alexandria itself. The city you found will be the apple of the word's eye. As the years and the ages go by, it'll grow in greatness, and it will be adorned with numerous temples, magnificent sanctuaries, exceeding all in their beauty, size, and number. Everyone who comes to dwell in it, we will forget the land that bore him, i.e. either Greece, or indeed of Egypt. I myself shall be its protector, unaging, uncorrupted, and shall establish it so that it remains forever. I shall level its deeps and inspire its flames. I shall forbid the unhealthy south wind to blow upon it. And that's another interesting note, is that the presence of Alexandria was specifically determined on the idea of its favorable winds. There was a cooling effect on the city in terms of some issue regarding all Egyptian cities, of course, is the paralytic heat. But Alexandria was shown for its very efficacious position regarding the cool winds that blow on it, so that the evil influence, the wicked spirits, will be unable to trouble the city at all. There shall be earthquakes only for a short time. Famine and plague will be brief also, and war bring but little slaughter, drifting rather like a dream through the city. Many people from many lands will worship you, even in your lifetime as a god. After death you shall be deified and worship, and you'll receive the gift of kings. You shall live in it for all time, dead and yet not dead. The city you have built shall be your tomb. It also comes in this whole notion of Serapis warning Alexander about the apportioned time of his death. But again, it's a rather sort of meta commentary in terms of the legacy of Alexander is invested very much in the city. In the city, he's been deified, and the fact that there have been many Alexandrias. There are still many Alexandrias, but none that have been quite so associated with legacy as the original Alexander. And in terms of, again, all the allusions you can sort of bring up further, and that's just in terms of the mythology and the foundations of the city. If you want to find out more what I have to say about Rome's foundation, regarding its Chalcedonian and Corinthian origins, I've done various episodes regarding that on this channel already. But in terms of the mythic associations, it goes forward. So following on from the conquest of Persia, according to the romances, Alexander attempts various conquests explicitly of the impossible, He goes into the lands of the giant apples. He faces off against the 36 feet tall men, the land of the headless men, and all hair and no heads. He goes into a river of trees, which possesses a forbidden sap, and where the fishes shoot out flames. There he goes into the regions of insurmountable depth, etc. I mean, obviously, if you read this isn't to be taken as a historical account. But
I mean, this definitely sounds very, very poetical and very improbable and very, very romanticized from the style itself. Just basic hermeneutics, you can distinguish between what is alluding to a historical fact, at least, and something that's very flourished.
Indeed, but this is where it gets very interesting. So I've already talked about, again, the interest in terms of combining the origin point of the city of Alexandria with the foundation of the city of Constantine and Constantinople, or indeed the foundation of Rome itself, and indeed how this is going to be a mirror for the way that the Greeks found many cities when they eventually conquered the old Persian Empire. But we then go on in the Romance to find the waters of immortality as part of Alexander's expedition to the land of the blessed. There is a river where a fish inexplicably rises from the dead. One of his followers, Andreas, discovers there is the secret of immortality. Basically, this is sort of an older allusion to the fountain of youth. In this story, he hoards the water and eventually seduces one of Alexander's daughters. Alexander finds out about this and curses both of them. In particular, he recasts his daughter, I believe is Cary, as Nereida, the Phantom of the Sea. In the Song of Alexander, which is another interpretation of this folklore, is that the water is basically turned into a baptismal motif, and the rising of the fish again, the fish coming back to life, is actually an allusion to Christ and the feeding of the 5,000. And then we have other allusions in the Romance. So, for example, Alexander attempts to explore the heavens by a casket which is pulled into the heavens by griffins. Some people have interpreted this as a chariot taking him up to the heavens, in which case, again, there's a direct reference of the translation of Elijah and that story bleeding into the myth regarding Alexander. And then we finally come to a very interesting point regarding to the eventual expedition of Alexander to India versus this idea of him pursuing the impossible. Soon a flying creature in the form of a man approached me, again, this is all from the Romance, and said, "O Alexander, you have not yet secured the whole earth, and are you now exploring the heavens? Return to earth as fast as possible, or you will become food for these birds." He went on, "Look down on earth, Alexander, look down." Somewhat afraid, and behold, I saw a great snake curled up in the middle of in the middle of the snake, a tiny circle like a threshing floor. Then my companion said to me, "Point your spear at the threshing floor, for that is the world. The snake is the sea that surrounds the world." Now, again, I found that very interesting in terms of various allusions you can draw to that. One interpretation of that is that Alexander is essentially trying to breach the gates of heaven, like entering into Eden. If you read J.R. Tolkien, this is actually a recurring motif in Tolkien, in that there is no direct path that exists between Middle-earth and Valinor. And one of the great affronts of Sauron is that he beguiles the last king of the Númenóreans, Ar-Pharazôn, into assaulting heaven, in which case, like Alexander, he is attempting to achieve the impossible. Again, going back to the illusion of snakes, Olympias, Serapis, and the way you can interpret basically his origins in the Christian sense of being related to God, but also being demonic in a way. The snake, again, that surrounds the world. This actually attests to an idea at the time that because the earth is round, that if Alexander continued to conquer eastwards and take over control of India, there would be a lane which would take him all the way back to Macedon. But of course, that would have been an impossible endeavor in the 4th century BC. But my interpretation of this is that another thing that comes through, which is actually borne out by some of the historical record, is the Caspian Gates, or the Gates of Alexander. For reference, there are fortresses in Gorgan, in the Khorasan region in Iran, and Derbent, which used to be part of Persia but is now southern Russia, near the cities of Grozny and Chechnya and Dagestan. And there had been many sort of Sasanian fortifications built on top of this. So in terms of the actual archaeology, it's rather difficult to determine. But these are the commonly assumed gates of Alexander, which he built at the end of the empire. The more mundane interpretation of that is that he was building a wall against the Scythians. A lot of imagination in terms of going into the work around this time. So this would have been the 4th century. So we're talking about the Huns. I mean, the Visigoths. I mean, what was it? The Emperor Valens was slain in battle. What was it? Adrianople. A few decades after this, and of course the Huns had just begun their migration period and setting the migration period off in general. So this was a theme regarding relating this back to the gates of Alexander and the Scythians, that Alexander was holding essentially command of the entry point to the world itself. Then there is the allusion in the Romance to the 22 nations of Gog and Magog. In other words, Alexander the Great is actually kind of like a catacomb. He's restraining the forces of the demons from breaking out. In other words, he's recreated the situation that you have with the Olympian gods and the Titans. And finally, there is the prospect that there is a prophecy regarding him at the end of time, Alexander opening the gates and waging war on Gog and Magog, i.e. the harrowing of hell, or the apocalypse. So again, I bring up all this folklore, and this is where I'm going to leave the segment on the Romance of Alexander, deliberately basically to say that in terms of the medieval imagination, all of these things were being associated with Alexander as this divinely inspired proto-Christian archetype.
No, this is a great parallel, because passing the Caspian Gate is almost like a mythical act, and I think the interpretation is very much in the spirit of the later writings, because it's almost like the end of the known world, the end of the map, and beyond it there's something unknown, because he could have stopped there. He defeated the archenemy of Greece, the Persians, and beyond that, that's somewhat of an unknown world. And as you said, that's true. Like it was associated or identified as Gog and Magog from the biblical tradition. So let's say his campaign becomes, after this point, it becomes almost like cosmical. Up to Gaugamela, you would have been probably simply justified by a necessity, by something that was already known in the Greek world. But beyond that, there was something cosmic, beyond the, let's say, establishment or the general Hellenic vision, so to say. And we could talk later on about the oikumene, the Hellenistic concept, this community, this continuum of Hellenic thought, how expansive it was. And that is actually a kind of, I can't find the word, like a Weltanschauung, like a worldview that was so specific to the Greeks, that allowed Alexander to put into practice such a grand vision and be followed by the army, because the vision, Hellenism itself is a culture, and it's a religion, but not in the let's say the cultish type of religion. Hellenism is kind of a grand idea that developed over centuries, and it has different pillars of principles of identity. Greeks saw themselves as Greeks, as Hellenes, because they believed in certain things, and the idea was to make it expansive. So Alexander made it expansive, actually, because before that he was just limited to right by birth. You're Greek, you're not barbarian because you're born like that, but spreading this culture has like a metaphysical, a mythical dimension to it. And yeah, that's why it's fascinating to talk about it in terms of symbolisms and mythology as well.
In terms of, again, that connection, one explicit interpretation is not just creating, again, seeing the snake around the world and looking down on the earth. There's also, and Alexander basically being locked out of heaven. But it's also the idea that looking down on earth means essentially abandon these increasingly farcical and self-defeating conquests in order to deal with the issue of governing. And that comes the whole notion of Homonoia, where we finally get to, again, his Hellenic revolution, and again, why the Hellenic period is associated with Alexander. The segment I have here, secondary literature, is from Reinhart Koselleck's Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time. Indeed, Reinhart Koselleck is one of these authors which sort of completely revolutionized much of my historical thinking in terms of the sort of times I've covered him before in this channel, one of which was to cover the Alexander Schlacht, which was the Altdorfer's interpretation of the Battle of Issus and what it meant in terms of the conceptions of time in the 16th century, the Reformation. But here in this book, he has a short segment regarding Hellenes and barbarians at the time of Alexander. Barbarian has until the present generally been usable in neutral scientific language, as well as in the more charged political language. On the other hand, the expression Hellen, which had originally defined barbarian negatively, survives only as a historical or specific name for a people, and this is the legacy of the Hellenic Republic and modern Greece. The classical conceptual couple belongs to history, though it displays model-like classical features which occur throughout the course of history. Words existed as independent terms before being arranged as polarities. All non-Greeks were treated as barbarians before the Greeks collectively dubbed themselves as the Hellenes. From the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, so before the time of Alexander the Great, the conceptual couple of Hellen and barbarian became a universal figure of speech, which included all of humanity through assignation to one of the two spatially separated groups. This figure was asymmetrical. Contempt for aliens, stammerers, and the incoherent was expressed by a series of negative epithets, degrading the whole of humanity beyond Hellas. The barbarians not only were formerly non-Greeks or aliens, but also as aliens was defined negatively. They were cowardly, unskillful, gluttonous, brutish, and so on. For every definition, there was empirical evidence: contact with overseas traders, the mass of foreign slaves, devastation of the homeland by invading Persians, and similar experiences could easily be generalized without seeming to need revision. The Greek intelligentsia were certainly clear-sighted enough to notice deviations from this pattern. For example, Herodotus came to realize the relativity of the concept of barbarian, and Plato criticized the lack of equilibrium in the conceptual couple arising from the divergence of typification and the criterion of that division. Regarding Herodotus, the way, again, what's significant about him finding, you could say, deviations in this pattern is because Herodotus, again, is most known for his accounts of the Greco-Persian Wars. In many ways, you can say Herodotus is partly responsible, not in terms of his personal intentions, but in terms of the historical record for lionizing the whole idea of this great ethnic conflict between Greeks or Hellenes and barbarians. The name of one people, the Hellenes, became the counter-concept for all the rest, who were assembled under a collective name which was simply the negative of Hellen. Asymmetry was thus systematically based on a conscious contrast of a specific name with a generic classification. It was certainly possible for the Greeks to point to features that they had in common and which the aliens lacked: the creation of the polis as a civil constitution opposed to Oriental monarchy, their physical and intellectual education, their language, art, their oracles, their cult festivals. These united the Hellenic peoples and excluded barbarians. Thus, there was evidence that appeared to confirm the positive image of the Hellenes as mild, educated, free citizens. The barbaric fashion in which Hellenes actually treated themselves, and where their self-image was correct, where it was not, whereas wishful thinking was described soberly and sympathetically by Jacob Burckhardt, again, one of these other sort of great historians who I owe a lot of intellectual debt for. Aside from the relevance or irrelevance of the dualistic evaluation, this conceptual couple assumed a structure which made political experience and expectation possible, while at the same time restricting it. This is apparent in the arguments that we use to justify differentiation of the two concepts. Plato, with typical seriousness, but certainly with an intention to provoke, reduced the contrast of one to one of nature, physi. The Hellenes are a distinct species from the degenerates, with increasing intermingling with barbarians. From this naturalistic definition, he draws the political conclusion that any dispute among the Greeks is an argument among brothers, stasis, a civil war, and therefore pathological. A war with barbarians, polemos, on the other hand, is justified by nature. Conflicts among the Greeks should be conducted in a mild manner with minimal force, while wars against barbarians should aim at annihilation. This asymmetrical dualism then contributes to the creation of a political interior which is shielded from the entirety of the outside world, or the world essentially that again would motivate the unification of Greece in terms of being able to fight the great other, that being the Persian Empire, or at least you can see very much that that was the logic of people behind Philip and the Argead dynasty, the Macedonian monarchy, in terms of the Greeks have been fighting each other, especially in the Peloponnese Wars, for centuries, and as a result they've only been able to hold on to little provinces and cities along the Asia Minor coastline, but now the Greeks could be united in terms of this greater struggle. You know, at the same time, once you boil it down and reduce it to that simple concept, in sort of many sort of much academic discourses, the process of othering, it's not something sort of unique to the Hellenes, but in terms of their own identification, it's in terms of what we are not. In this case, we are not the Persians or their satrapies, and that's why Alexander sort of revolutionizes the concept. I have a rather sort of different segment to read after that, but just before I get onto that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that segment.
No, I really enjoyed this segment because I think it's very important to, first of all, clarify what Hellen, the word Hellen means, because we talk about Greeks, and obviously that has a Latin etymology, Latin root, but how the let's say that the notion itself developed over centuries is, I think it's very common to the formation of identities, ethnic or national identities, because it starts as something very, very restrictive and very, very specific, and then it gains some sort of traction, and there has to be like a common, let's say, background or substance that allows people to be unified. So we have variations of the same language. Greeks have always been split in so many tribes. We talked about the Dorian dynasty with Alexander the Great. We have the Ionians. We have so many different tribes, and the history is very, very complex if you look at the specifics of it. But I was thinking, because I think the first time, I think you probably mentioned that, but probably just to reiterate and also to gather my thoughts, because I think Thucydides mentions that Homer is the first one to use the word Hellenes, Elliniki or Elada, that's Greece in Greek today, but he uses it to describe a very specific tribe of Greeks that accompanied Achilles in the Trojan War. So I think he was from a province, I don't know how to pronounce it in English, but it's something like Phthiotida, and then later on the concept broadens, and I think the first time when we can refer to all the Greek tribes as Hellenes was during the or after the first Olympics in 776 BC, of course. And you mentioned Herodotus, which mentioned Greeks in different contexts. Sometimes it's not necessarily a qualitative difference because he praises both Greeks and barbarians based on their deeds. Sometimes it's really demeaning, and I think a very interesting and not necessarily something that most people think about is the implications from Euripides' Medea. So we have, I don't think I have I cannot remember the quote, but there's a scene where Jason explains Medea, the advantages of running away with him. And he says something that, first of all, you no longer live with the barbarians, you are in Ellada. And then now you know justice and you know how to use laws against brute force. So you already have these very specific differentiators, that being a Hellen meant that you have a justice system, you have laws that govern society, and you do not use brute force. You prefer diplomacy, wisdom, philosophia, which is the love of wisdom. And then later on, when Medea kills her children, as we know the horrible deed, there's a quote, "There's no woman in Ellada who could do such a thing." So again, it's another differentiator compared to the barbarians. Greeks are supposed to appeal to higher morals. And even if we look at Homer, when we know the tragedy with Iphigenia, I think we can extrapolate and interpret from the text itself that there's something really appalling, and human sacrifice was even later on seen as something very barbarian. So the Greeks distinguished themselves already by abiding to laws, having a deep sense of justice, and opposing brute force. And I think these things are crystallized into the collective mentality through the schools of thought that flourished later on in Alexandria, as we mentioned, in Athens, and then we could talk the first. Actually, I would even say that the first university, let's say Christian university, was founded in 425, if I'm not mistaken, in Constantinople, and it overshadowed the previous universities in Alexandria and Athens, and Greek was always the main language there. But I diverged right now.
Well, thank you for that. I'm probably going to rearrange my thoughts in particular, but this is where, in terms of being able to identify that division and why is this significant? Well, of course, for Herodotus writing about these sort of things, it's all about, I mean, you mentioned oikoumene, and you mentioned the whole idea of a Weltanschauung, or worldview, essentially. I've also referred to another German word, which is Gestalt. But all of these notions basically indicate that if the Hellenes consider themselves as part of a closed worldview, which isolates and doesn't consider the barbarian, who doesn't speak our language, then what Alexander is doing in terms of essentially trying to embody the political project of someone like Cyrus is causing a revolution. Just to summarize, this is an article by Henry M. de Mauriac, Alexander the Great and the Politics of Homonoia. The idea of the unity of mankind is sprung from the Greek concept of homonoia. Homonoia is a difficult word to translate, but it means unity and concord, a being of one mind together. The Greeks recognized the desirability of homonoia, but they interpreted it in a negative manner, the absence of faction fights, which is going back to this whole idea of stasis brought up in Plato. There was hardly a trace, as yet, of the more positive sense in which homonoia was later to acquire, a mental attitude which would make war or faction impossible because the parties were at one. By proposing to treat the whole Greek world as one, and the futile wars between city and city as faction fights, Isocrates extended the meaning from the traditional Greek interpretation of unity and concord within a city. It was this extended concept of homonoia which Isocrates presented to Philip, the concept which Philip adopted when he made himself hegemon of the Corinthian League. In other words, it's taken out of this whole idea of concord within the city, and it's being projected still within this insular concept of a Hellenic homonoia, a unity of mankind, albeit still contained within this paradigm, this polarity of concepts between Hellenes and barbarians. Although Isocrates did not accept the Platonic contention that all barbarians were slaves by nature, he employed a Platonic idea that the Greek world should unite against the natural enemy, the barbarians. The barbarians in this case were the Persians, and Isocrates saw that the quickest and easiest path to Greek unity lay in a holy war against the Persians. With the death of Philip, the influence of Isocrates declined. Alexander, the pupil of Aristotle, naturally turned to the Aristotelian concept of homonoia. Aristotle told Alexander to treat Greeks as friends, but barbarians like animals. But Alexander knew better, preferred to divide men into good and bad without regard to their race. Alexander probably realized that it would be better to treating the inhabitants of a conquered country as free men rather than as slaves, to deal with the problems of administration. Although Alexander did not accept the Platonic homonoia, his theory of the unity of mankind was not inconsistent with the Platonic thesis that anything is possible if the structure is harmonious and displeasing. Indeed, this whole notion is attested to by Plutarch, and indeed the Romance, the segment in the Romance reads as thus. Alexander came to Hyperia, the city of Berbices. Here there was a temple which stood a statue of Orpheus, around which the Pyrrhian muses and wild beasts. When Alexander looked at it, the statue broke out in a sweat. Alexander inquired the meaning of this omen, and Melampus, the interpreter, told him, "You will have to struggle, King Alexander, with toil and sweat to subdue the nations, the barbarians, and the cities of the Greeks. But just as Orpheus, by his music and song, won over the Greeks, put the barbarians to flight, and tamed the wild beasts, so you, by your labor of your spear, will make all men your subjects." And emphasizing this is a segment taken from G.B. Burry's A History of Greece. Alexander must meet the Orientals on their own ground. He must become their king in their own way. The surest means of planting Hellenism in their midst was to begin by taking account sympathetically of their prejudices. Alexander assumed the state of great king, surrounded himself with Eastern forms and pomp, exacted self-abasement in his presence from Oriental subjects, and adopted the maxim that the king's person was divine. He hoped ultimately to secure uniformity in the relations of the Macedonians and the Persians to their king. Such was the position of Alexander as great king of Persia. It was this course of action which he chose as the most satisfactory method of attaining the sought-after homonoia. There were two important difficulties in Alexander's approach as great king. The first was an attempt to create an artificial social structure in which all races and nations held social equality with all others. So, for example, in terms of outlining how difficult this was, Alexander had become king of Babylon by his conquests, which it should be noted, it's not just that he's taking over the Persian Empire, he's taking over all of the satrapies of the Persian Empire. So he's inheriting all of the political relations and the issues of administration that the Persians had, and then adding another Hellenistic layer on top of it. If anything, that would confound most matters of administration, but nevertheless, the Greeks were able to achieve something. So Alexander was king of Babylon. He was the king of kings of Persia. Persia, it should be referenced, is just this, more or less corresponds to this territory around Shiraz in Iran, which is south, just east of the region of Khuzestan. He was also the great king, the lord of Asia. Asia had a much more sort of nebulous meaning, but you can say Asia being sort of synonymous with this great landmass east of Hellas is actually as a result of the conquest of Alexander, trying to link all of these vast territories he conquered from Asia Minor to India and Afghanistan and even Uzbekistan as being part of this landmass of Asia. It is the Asian Empire in many ways that he represents, but that in itself would also be a bit of an anachronism. Yes, he is the great king, he is the Lord of Asia, but he rules over all of mankind, not just the Asians, whatever that means. He was also the Pharaoh of Egypt, in addition to being the king of Macedon and the hegemon of the League of Corinth, or hegemon of Greece, which, it should be mentioned, many of his Greek subjects, as to be expected, were under a much looser form of control than many of his new conquered subjects. So this, again, on the surface, would seem to cause incalculable problems of administration. In terms of the idea that was placed there by Alexander, of course, he was only able to administer for around 8 years, and he spent most of that period at war. So it became an issue for the Diadochi, for the successors, inheriting the politics of the Hellenes and the barbarians, which, if anything, indicates that this project was not a complete failure. It was simply taken over by others who were trying to ensure his legacy. In particular, there were three great Hellenic successor states that you can say really formalized around the time of the year 280. So Macedon was inherited by this dynasty called the Antigonids. The Ptolemies, as mentioned, were able to take over in Egypt, but they were also able to take over a vast Eastern Mediterranean empire that included parts of Crete, part of southern Anatolia, and also parts of Cyprus and Syria. But the largest of the successor states is actually that of Seleucus Nicator, Seleucus the Victorious, who was actually a relatively minor companion of Alexander. He wasn't even really involved in the first great struggles of the Diadochi between, 323 and 312. But nevertheless, around the year 312, Seleucus Nicator is able to establish himself as king in Babylon, and by the year 305, he's able to establish himself as the principal lord of Asia. And it's really through figures like Ptolemy and Seleucus, and to a much lesser extent the Antigonids, that Alexander's legacy will endure for centuries. It should be mentioned. The Greek legacy in Syria and Egypt and Anatolia isn't really lost to the extent that we can still consider that as sort of complete and utter cultural revolution in terms of de-Hellenization until progressive stages within the Arab conquest. And with, of course, regard to places like Persia and Afghanistan and India, of course, that dropped off much sooner. But this indicates a sort of remarkable attempt to syncretize many elements of this new Hellenic culture and the barbarian culture into a new religion and the foundation of new cities. I have a segment which is written in a book comparing the Seleucid and Ptolemaic legacies. In particular, this is a chapter written by Sitta von Reden and Rolf Stoneman on the idea of legitimating this universal rule of the Homonoia of the Hellenes and using it through Greek mythology to try and form a link with the gods that already exist, and trying to say we're also restoring Greek deities to these regions. I've already alluded to the Alexandrian foundation myth, but this also applies to other great Hellenic cities that we see in the east. So Seleucia, Pieria, Antioch on the Orontes, Laodicea. And the trope that often assumes is that a sacrifice to Zeus is made, and then an eagle representing Zeus will snatch the sacrifice, and wherever the sacrifice lands, that will be the divinely consecrated location. We see this with the foundation of Alexandria, and we also see this with the creation of the original Seleucia, which is near Ctesiphon, that later became the city of Baghdad. And this is the segment. On the 23rd day of the month of Xanthicus, Seleucus went up to Mount Cassius in order to sacrifice to Zeus. After completing the sacrifice and cutting the meat, Seleucus prayed where to find a city. Suddenly an eagle snatched the meat from the sacrifice and took it away to the old city. Following behind were his augurs. Seleucus found that the meat had been dropped near the sea, below the old city, in the place called the trading station of Pieria. Immediately he constructed walls and built the foundations of a city, which he called Seleucia, after his own name. Together, these tales suggest a divine plan, consisting of 3 successive acts of creation. First, Zeus frees the place of a primordial chaos to make civilized order possible. Zeus does so, for instance, when he battles the serpentine chaos monster Typhon, thrusting thunderbolts at him from Mount Cassius and forcing him underground to become the snake-like river Orontes. In terms of this motif of destroying the serpent and bringing order to a new land in order to form a city, I mean, Ruxandra, this should be sending off some alarm bells, because we read out this exact passage talking about Eliada.
Sounds extremely familiar. I think everything that we're talking about is a great example of the myth of the eternal return and all those archetypal acts and rituals. Since you mentioned that the audience might not necessarily be very, very familiar with the history of Alexander the Great, I think it's really important to remind everyone that one of Alexander's mentors was Aristotle. So he had grand ideas from a very early age, and that's why the Macedonian Empire, let's say, and then later on the Roman Empire, I would say, because I think that the Roman Empire excelled through administration and organization, but the soul, I would say that it was Greek, and the culture, the substratum was still Greek, even in the Roman Empire and the high Roman culture, which became something quite natural in the East. But there's there's so many interesting pathways from here to talk about ideas of universalism these great empires, they have this component that is civilizational, and it's almost like soteriological. I'm forcing the theological term right now because Alexander, we have the example of the Susa weddings in 324, where he actually, it's a good example of his idea of universalism. He encourages officers to marry foreign women. He saw them as equals, but still under the Hellenistic worldview as an umbrella. There was a sort of like universalist idea, not necessarily like a multicultural empire in a way, yes, because he respected to some degree the foreign nations, but this idea of spreading culture, the Hellenistic culture, as a redemptive act of establishing a new order. And exactly what you said, we're going back to the idea of like bringing order into chaos. The barbarian world was for the Greeks chaos. I think all these grand ideas were unfortunately ideas, but they were never resolved in practice. So that's one of the weaknesses of the empire. That's why it just collapsed immediately after, not necessarily because of the lack of successors appointed by Alexander himself.
Well, as mentioned, this was one of the non-appointed successors, Seleucus, who was able to make a rather successful go of it in terms of a dynasty. I mean, it was able to hold on to about 3/4 of the empire of Alexander, really up until the Battle of Magnesia at the end of the 2nd century. But I'll just continue on this tangent because it really is fascinating in terms of alluding to many elements you bring up here in terms of trying to find some sort of Hellenistic, polytheistic, as in a multitude of gods sort of integrated into one sort of super Asian religion, or by the turning of primordial giants into stone, still to be seen today in the form of the rock pillars in the Orientis Valley. Much later, one of his sons, this being Zeus, Perseus or Heracles, founded the sanctuary at the spot where Zeus had earlier manifested himself. The foundation of an altar is the basic prerequisite for an establishment of community. Finally, Seleucus, guided by Zeus, rediscovers the ancient sanctuary and founds a city there as a third and final act of creation. One does not have to be a structuralist in order to recognize a divine plan in the recurrent attempts to inscribe Seleucus into a drawn-out mythical narrative. Well, essentially what this means in part is that obviously everyone is reading this with an element of postmodernism in terms of being able to deconstruct these various religious acts. But again, in terms of what we talk about with hierophany, is that in many we're essentially involved in the idea of participating in acts of the divine and shedding the divine light on the events of these various acts of creation. So yes, you can see it as part of an attempt to politically Hellenize these territories by establishing a known religion, but there did seem to be a genuine impetus coming from figures like Seleucus, not simply this act of political necessity. I mean, I think the clearest distillation of this mentality is actually Napoleon. Napoleon, of course, for people who don't know, invaded Egypt in 1798. And he visited the supposed tomb of Alexander the Great. He was obsessed with Alexander the Great. In fact, it comes back to my Alexander Schlacht anecdote about earlier. But one of the things he says about Alexander Napoleon is that I found that the idea of Alexander becoming a god, as in Zeus Ammon of Egypt, was inspired by a feeling of good politics. That is very much the post-French Revolutionary attitude. But continuing on, the myths explaining that the sanctuaries at the core of these migrant settlements are not founded, but found, are charter myths that turn these colonies into homecoming and enable settlers to claim lands as originally theirs. So this is why, again, it may seem incongruous when I was reading it out, but there was actually a very strong reason why I read out the segment on the birth of Alexander as being related to the Egyptians and the pharaohs, is that this whole motif that is not simply the Greeks are conquering the world, but the Greeks are restoring the world. It's a parallel idea that they are fighting this holy war against the barbarians. They're also reclaiming possession of it, and yet they're also integrating their administrations of it at the same time. All of these ideas seem to go hand in hand when forming this new universalism, that they are not founded, but they are found, they are recovered. In terms of this whole notion of migration, we're talking about like 200,000 Greek migrants respectively going into Egypt and going into Syria. and to a lesser extent other settlements in Mesopotamia and even further east. I mean, the whole thing concerning these great Greek cities built of gold in Markanda and Bactria, and the valleys of sort of modern day Uzbekistan around the cities of Bukhara, Tashkent, are no doubt exaggerated, but they nevertheless attest to this idea that there was, for a brief period of time during the 3rd and the 4th centuries BC, this great drive towards Greek colonization inspired by these conquests.
If I can say something very short, because it's very, very short and it's not something really substantial, but it's very interesting to think about the folklore after Alexander, that almost 2,000 years after the conquest, we have remaining beliefs, and even, for instance, there's this beret, Macedonian beret, like a sort of a hat that's quite versatile, and you can adjust it, to protect you from the sun. And it has like this base that is very thick and fluffy. It's made of wool. It used to be called, it was called kausia, and it's still worn in Afghanistan today, exactly like it used to be during the Macedonian Empire. And there's a lot of local beliefs. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was reading this book written by, maybe some people from the audience, maybe you are familiar with the French author Sylvain Tesson. He's also an explorer, and he went on an expedition on the Silk Road towards the east. He actually did it on horseback, just a crazy idea, right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he was there with a friend, a woman who's a photographer, also French, blonde. And they camped with some shepherds from, I think it was Tajikistan, interestingly. And the elder said that the woman looks exactly like Roxanne. She's blonde with blue eyes. So I was just thinking about how strong the collective conscience, still celebrating Alexander the Great. There's still ballads and elements of folklore that are really, really strong. And it's almost kind of paradoxical, because I had to do some illustrations about Alexander recently, and I was looking at pictures of Afghan shepherds to understand how the kausia looks, for instance, or the elements. Yeah.
I mean, you're referring, the sort of greatest exponent of this idea was probably Rudyard Kipling and The Man Who Would Be King, and his Kafiristan, which is a region, I think, bordering Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So you're right in saying that at least sort of apocryphal elements of this legacy continue forward. MC Yankee, you haven't been listening to anything we've been saying. Anyway, I'll just finish this segment. Greek myths such as the story of Apollo and Daphne are inscribed in the Syrian landscape, often on pre-existing sacred sites, such as is most certainly the case with the Peak Sanctuary at the top of Mount Cassius, and very probably next to the sacred grove of Daphne. But more may be going on here than just a colonial exploit. The translation of local cults into Greek cults also facilitates the interaction between these various colonists and the local populations. An interesting example of this procedure is the Syrian version myth of Io, which directly responds to the Ptolemaic version of that same myth. This myth contains another recurring trope, that of the presentation of indigenous populations as the descendants of earlier Greek migrants. Metalis reports that when Seleucus was looking for a site to found Seleucia, he discovered near the mouth of the Orontes a small city situated on the mountain, which had been founded by Cyrus, son of Agenor. Cyrus is the name giver of the land of Syria. More intriguing is the figure of Agenor, the mythical founder of the kingship in Syria, is the grandson of Zeus and of Io. Agenor is the central figure in a web of connections that links Syria and Phoenicia to Egypt and to Europe. From Strabo, we know that Seleucus discovered an ancient settlement on Mount Seleucus, the Acropolis of Antioch. This place was said to have been founded by settlers from Argos, who called it Iopolis. Pausians of Antioch recounts an earlier discovery set out in a mythical past, in which the protagonist is the Argive hero Perseus. Perseus, after ruling the Persian lands for many years, learning that Iopolitans from Argos were living in the Syrian land, came to them in Syria and Mount Seleucus as to his own relatives. Those same Argive Iopolitans recognized him because he too was descended from the race of Argives. Rejoicing, they hymned him. Perseus appears in his capacity as the progenitor of the Persians. On this occasion, Perseus is introduced to the cult of Zeus the Thunderbolt on Mount Seleucus. Sorry, I keep for some reason mispronouncing that name each time, but it is Seleucus, which was rediscovered by Seleucus. Seleucus returned rejoicing to Iopolis, and after 3 days he celebrated a festival for Zeus the Thunderbolt in the temple which had been established by Perseus, the son of Picus and of Danae, on Mount Seleucus, where Iopolis is situated. He performed the sacrifice on the first day of the month of Artemisios. We then go on to talk about the link between Phoenix and that of Phoenicia. So this whole motif is then repeated throughout all of the Greek respective conquests. But this whole notion again that Perseus is the progenitor of the Persians themselves, trying to sort of derive all these terms etymologically, as with other figures such as Europa, and also looking at this figure of Dionysius, for example, in Roman, or be Bacchus, as the primordial sort of conqueror of Asia, and the particular association with Daphne, who is one of these nymphs in Greek mythology, to the city of Antioch. All of these sort of interesting allusions sort of focus on one point, is that if you were to look at the original concept of homonoia, as alluded to by Plato, and see it as a means of resolving internal struggles, then what better than to recontextualize homonoia by saying, actually, no, this is all a recollection, a regathering of all the peoples of the world. We can resolve the contest between the Hellenes and the barbarians by saying, actually, no, you were Hellenes all along, and our mythology actually proves it. Which is an interesting scenario, but this was earnestly practiced and implemented in terms of the cults, the sanctuaries, the temples, not only in the Seleucid Empire, in Syria and Asia Minor and Phoenicia, but also all across Egypt, where this interesting diarchy exists between the Hellenic Alexandria and the very much Egyptian Memphis. And on the one hand, you have the reverence of Zeus, Ammon, and of course, the Egyptian Isis, who remains the most popular god at this time. And then we go on to a more lofty exposition of the universalism, which actually comes to Diogenes. And reading both the Romance and reading Plutarch's Lives, he comes up in both of them, but this is the segment taken from the Romance regarding the encounter between Alexander and Diogenes. When the war, this was the war involving the Corinthian League, was over, Alexander went to look at the dedications. He found Diogenes sitting in a sunny place and said, "Who are you?" Those around him replied, "This, your majesty, is Diogenes, the philosopher, who so often advised the Athenians to fight against your power." When Alexander heard this, he went up to the place where Diogenes was sitting, sunning himself. It was morning, and he was leaning on his barrel, and said to him, "Diogenes, what favor can I do for you?" "Nothing," replied Diogenes, "except to go away and leave me to my sunshine, so that I can warm myself." People found Diogenes amazing in his indifference, and this complemented by a quote apparently from Alexander, which comes from Plutarch: "Were I not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." In other words, there is this complete sort of repudiation of the world, this veneration of poverty, and of course Diogenes being associated with the tradition of Greek cynics, that Alexander, if he were not this great political animal, if he had not been made again in the guise of a lion in order to conquer the Persian Empire, he would have been Diogenes. And I found reading this, among many things, is that they form a strange synergy in your mind, all of these things coming together, is that it just so happened that conversely, Diogenes happened to be one of these sort of greater thinkers regarding this whole notion of universalism, and in particular cosmopolitanism, because then Koselleck will go on to write, in the course of rapidly passing Greek history, what Koselleck's referring to is the fact that all of these events in Greek history have been condensed to the period of 12 years of Alexander the Great's reign. The actual polarities of the concept of Hellenes and barbarians, attributable as they were to physis, as in the physical, coming out of Plato, did become less sharp. The Hellenic antithesis was negated by Diogenes when he privately described himself as Apolis, Aeokos, or Patridos Hester Amentos, without, however, becoming a non-Hellenic barbarian. He coined the universalistic concept of cosmopolite, with the object of transcending the usual dualisms. The antithesis became appreciably less evident following Alexander's forcible fusion of Greek and the barbarian. You're referring to the weddings of Susa earlier. Mankind and its political organization appeared to approximately coincide, first under Alexander and later within the Roman Imperium. But just before I get back to that, anything you would like to say on that?
Oh no, I was kind of smiling because I remembered you mentioned apolis. It basically means antisocial, and I thought that was really funny because being antisocial was not being a Hellen. It would mean to be a barbarian. So it's funny the vision of the time, and also I remember that it was the first. I think it was one of the first sentences I learned in Greek. It was in school. Exactly this line: "Mikron apo tou iliou metastethi." Like, can you move away from the sun so I can get the sunshine? It's very fascinating actually to delve into this this facet of the Alexandrian Empire, especially with Diogenes. He was quite a character, and both of them became immortalized because one was seeking freedom by different means, and the other one glory. But yeah, it was just. It was just the apolis that reminded me of other principles that defined Hellenism. Is magnanimity too. I remember, I don't know the source, but I took some notes about this. It was megalopsychos. It was a common principle to be magnanimous. And then metrios, know thyself, know your measure. It's an ancient Greek principles. And then philanthropos, it's also like another pillar, being humane, and also not being a brute and not being antisocial. These are defining, let's say, terms for a good Hellen.
So Diogenes was simultaneously a bad Hellen, yet also trying to completely recontextualize these concepts.
Yeah, of course.
Within this new unity and its intellectual apprehension as homonoia of all of humanity, the older dualism was nonetheless preserved. It was simply recast without relinquishing the continued division of all humanity into Hellenes and barbarians under identical terms. The distinction that had formerly been made spatial, i.e. the differences between Hellas and the Persian Empire, came to be deployed horizontally as a universal criterion of differentiation. Hellen was a person with a sufficient education, whether Greek or non-Greek, who merely had to be able to speak proper Greek, the remainder while barbarian. And of course, the emphasis on horizontal is that, well, Alexander has conquered the world and his legacy continues through the successors. And so it is about essentially removing that vertical distinction between a territory which is of us and of them, but now we are all mingled together. So it now becomes a intellectual and elite criterion to distinguish us. Thus, this new antithesis, which is organized around education, no longer derived from natural qualities to this extent. The counter-concepts were denaturalized and stripped of all spatial connection. Linguistic usage became functionally mobile, criterion of education transferable, and the term Hellen was applicable to ever more human groups. The directly political function of dualism, defining and promoting a condition of the domination, was lost. And from that point on, duality instead served as an indirect protection for the role of social leadership of the Hellenic educated stratum, which persisted throughout the political upheavals of the Diadochi period and the Roman occupation. What he's really alluding to here is that the Homonoia, of course, had preserved the Hellenic barbarian distinction, but it also, as he mentioned, recast it, meaning that the East would become the Greek East, despite the fact that it wasn't a simple matter of the Greeks colonizing everywhere and massacring the local populations, rather that there is a new social and linguistic elite, the proliferation, you could say the evolution of Doric and Attic Greek into Koine and later medieval Greek, the proliferation of this language as being a common language of epistles and of law and of diplomatic interactions. And later it'll become the language of administration, because Latin is never able to eclipse Greek during the period of the Roman Empire. So what he means in terms of being able to endure during the Roman Imperium is that what this process of horizontal Hellenization did is that it established the conditions for Byzantium, because it established a Hellenized Egypt and a Hellenized Syria and a Hellenized Anatolia, as these places were never Latinized to the extent that, say, for example, Gaul was, or Spain was. That meant that the conditions, you can say, for a revitalization of this Grecophone ideal, this Greek-speaking unity or polity in the East, was able to resurface when you get to the reigns of Heraclius during the 6th century, once Greek became the standard language of administration. And then you have the various reforms of emperors such as Leo the Wise into the 8th and the 9th century, which also formalize, you can say, the Greek-speaking aspect of this culture. So again, if Alexander has one part of his indelible legacy, it's the profusion and recontextualization of what it means to be a Hellen in the East, and Greek becoming the lingua franca, the most commonly spoken language all across the East, all the way up until we have the Arab conquest in the 7th century AD.
I was just thinking about something I never thought about, because we were discussing about the diadox, of course, like the legacy of the empire and the Seleucid dynasty that covered Judea afterwards. And in the book of Maccabees, which is not included, is considered by some parts of Christianity an apocryph book. We have the wars of the Maccabees against the Greek authorities, because they imposed, enforced Hellenization policies, and that created a lot of conflict. So we already are talking about enforcing Hellenic rules and mindset on people that are non-Greek. And you find in the Bible many references to Hellenized Jews. So Jews who were educated in the Greek world, and they were speaking Koine, probably, or a version of Greek, dialect of Greek. And yeah, we have, I like that you mentioned the horizontality problem of Homonoia. I think there's another concept that is very interesting. I was thinking about it before the podcast, about ecclesia, because ecclesia took a Christian meaning with the onset of Christianity in the Eastern Empire. But initially is the Greek assembly in Athens, where all the citizens would gather and they would discuss all the important state issues. And in the ecclesia, there was another principle, paresia, which was a freedom of speech, which they cherished very much. And they were allowed to say everything, almost anything they wanted to. But ecclesia, I think, extrapolated, that's what Christianity took to the next step. Ecclesia to the level of, let's say, the worldwide community of Hellenized people that were, we have this idea of, I'm sorry if I'm a little bit scattered, because I'm thinking about some terms that I think they're very important in how things developed and why this is such a consistent, substantial legacy that lasted for such a long time, because we're talking about more than 1,000 years of continuity. Is paideia, which is the kind of the Greek educational system. It's a word that is very, it's like homonoia. It's very difficult to translate. It is upbringing and education within the spirit of Hellenism, basically. And that's what impregnated the schools of Athens and Alexandria, and later on also the early academies. And I think what the world during the Roman Empire, during the, let's say, the crystallization of the Roman Empire and then the spread of Christianity, we don't have a homonoia, we have a sort of ecclesiocracy, if I can use that word, which has also a vertical component because it includes all people as long as they recognize the one true God. So it's very interesting to, I think it's good to have these terms in mind when we talk about why Christianity came over the Greek substratum and it didn't contradict, these two views did not contradict each other. Because Homonoia is also very difficult, even though we have common beliefs, polytheism, but we have a lot of philosophical schools which are by definition heterodox. So how do you reconcile heterodoxy with orthodoxy? So some things were very interesting, but it was one of the most like intellectually fertile noetic spheres, because we're talking about the nous, noetic, pertaining to the mind. And I think that's part of Alexander's vision. He wanted to create this noetic world that is very much influenced by Hellenism. But there was a lot of freedom of speech as well. It's very interesting. And I'm talking from these, like, from the point of view of overarching patterns and terms that were used in main schools of philosophy. So I'm really sorry if my parenthesis was more confusing than anything, but.
Well, I was going to mention regarding, again, idea is that, again, one of the great sort of figures linked to it is Isocrates and linked to this idea of homonoia, but of course this becomes sort of baked in later to the notion of humanitas in terms of being able to translate these ideas from Hellenic virtues into Roman virtues, Latin virtues. So we're seeing these ideas sort of being communicated essentially in this great cultural exchange that doesn't really eliminate the other. I mean, I did want to sort of think about referencing these very broad comparisons you can make in terms of, you can say, ways that the Greek gods that were presented, which made it, you could say, easier for them to convert to Christianity. So, for example, one of the aspects of Dionysus, who was afforded this great prided place among the Seleucids, and thereby the cult of Dionysus, later in Roman Bacchus, was incredibly prolific throughout the East, is the sort of very dubious elements you can terms to the connection to Christ. And then I was thinking of, the cult of Daphne, the sacred grove, and how prolific that was, and the ideation of the Virgin, of course, in Isis in Egypt, the mother of God. There's another sort of weird connection, is that we're going to be now getting into Alexander's connection with the Jews, but in the same way that the universalism and the homonoia was brought about in terms of basically saying that the Greek gods and the Greek peoples were here first, well, of course, there is the Jewish equivalent to that, which is the 12 tribes of Israel. You will find someone identifying any culture on earth as basically being representative of one of the lost tribes or representing some form of Abrahamic genealogy. One of them, of course, is Hayek in Armenia, which wasn't Hellenized. It was in the Greek sort of orbit. It was a Persian satrapy, but it sort of stood on the extremities and switched sides when it came to the Roman conquest. And of course, Hayek, the genealogy of Noah, the landing of Noah's Ark. And I was almost thinking in terms of looking at this as like the gathering of the tribes of Israel, but a Hellenic version is thinking about Joseph, and obviously linking to Jacob, who is Israel, and the cloak of many colors. There seem to be a lot of parallels in terms of what is happening in Greek mythology and what is happening in Judaism more generally. But this is when we finally come to the Old Testament and how Alexander appears. And this is an article by George Cary, and how medieval theology dealt with the question of the prophecy of Daniel in particular. And I referenced the fact that the Greek allegory is made explicit in Daniel 8:21. Alexander appears in two allegorical prophecies in the book of Daniel. In the first, he is the third of the four beasts, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and in the second a he-goat, who attacks the ram with 2 horns. Again, the emphasis on the horned god, going back to Ammon in Libya, and how this almost seemed to be retroactively fitted in order to connect to Daniel's prophecy, and overcomes him by breaking his horns. The first writer of importance of these passages was St. Jerome, who presented in his commentary an interpretation which was almost invariably held up by later writers, being a simple matter of interpreting a prophecy and not, as in Maccabees, a question of finding an apposite symbolism. When Alexander appears as the leopard, his 4 wings are interpreted as symbolic of the swiftness of his career of conquest, while the 4 heads intend his 4 successors. As the goat, he attacks Darius, the ram, whose 2 horns represent his 2 kingdoms of Media and Persia, and destroys his might. These 2 prophetic passages, in conjunction with a later reference to the king of Greece, who shall come to destroy Persia, are of great importance in the formulation of a theological conception of Alexander as divinely inspired prophecies. They make clear that Alexander's conquests were due not to his own power, but to the will of God, that he should destroy the wickedness of Persia, a point which St. Jerome actually made clear and which was thereafter invariably accepted. This comes to the prophecy of Daniel and the prophecy of the various succession of the kings in the Iron Giant, which I've talked about at length in a video dedicated to that, and it should also be mentioned to Koselleck. But it's the whole point that Christianity is a historical religion, and we have these greater Gentile intercessors in the history of events before we get to the Christ, before we get to the King of Peace. And Alexander is essentially apportioned a world-altering role as the conqueror of the Persian Empire, who will ultimately make way for the restoration of the King of the Jews. And this is in particular Josephus and Alexander. The account of Alexander and Josephus centers about his visit to Jerusalem. Alexander descending upon Jerusalem in wrath because a levy of troops had been refused to him, does obeisance to the high priest who comes out with the assembled priesthood and people in the pursuance of a divine injunction to greet him. Alexander does so because of his reverences in the priest, the earthly symbol of that god who had appeared to him in a dream and told him that he would be assisted in his conquest of Persia and might rest confident of success. He is conducted into Jerusalem by the rejoicing Jews, is shown the prophecy of Daniel relating to him, and makes sacrifices in the temple. On his departure, he makes various concessions to Jerusalem and to the Jews in the empire. This passage has been accepted by many theologians. Alexander would have been recognized as a reverent worshipper of God, and God as his personal protector, not merely the power unseen of Alexander that stood behind him in the destruction of the Persian Empire. Great emphasis of if, because of course Josephus is not a Christian apologetic or a Christian historian. He's simply a favored historian by Christians as a Jew. And this is St. Augustine's of Hippo, his great counterpoint to this account that would lead essentially to this idea that Alexander was the personal agent of God. Alexander's action is related to a meaner and hence more satisfactory motive in St. Augustine. Alexander adds Jehovah as another god to his collection, not from any supposed political objects in conciliating the Jews, still less from any reverence of God, but in the true spirit of a vain collector, a man who worships gods as he finds them. In this connection, there may be cited the passage brought forward by St. Augustine, St. Cyprian, and Minucius Felix in support of a euhemeristic theory of the origin of pagan gods. Alexander's letter to his mother, in which he describes how the priests of Ammon have explained to him how ancestor worship evolves into idolatry. If he did not believe in the reality of the pagan gods, he yet worshipped them. If he worshipped Jehovah, who was to say that he believed in Jehovah any more than in the others? So again, if you read that in terms of the implication, it's more than just political cynicism, as we're being alluded to here. It's simply a matter of collecting the cults of all the gods as the priestly assemblages are simply confronted to you. And again, it's not even a matter of conciliating them. It's simply a matter of again, kind of like the worst sort of pejorative is associated with the Pontifex, the great bridge builder of all these religions. It is simply to enmesh them into some sort of great religious hive, but of course, as Ammon Zeus, you are the bridge that connects all of these religions without prioritizing one or the other. There is a further passage of Josephus. It tells how God parted the waters of the Pamphylian Sea so that Alexander's troops might pass to pursue the Persians. Josephus stated that God let Alexander's army through the sea, that they may destroy the empire of the Persians. In fact, there is no need here of any explanation to make the incident concur with a derogatory theological conception of Alexander. In letting him through the Pamphylian Sea, God is fulfilling his own purpose, which concurs with Alexander's, only because God has put in his heart the wish to destroy the Persians. A reverent Alexander is not necessary to the explanation of this incident, which might as well be a step toward the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy by an unwilling Alexander, or you can perhaps more accurately say, an unwitting Alexander, whether he does so, with a sort of pious countenance, or whether he does so again to genuinely worship the Jewish God, to protect the Jewish people, or to honor Jehovah among the other gods, who he is, again, according to St. Augustine, simply collected. He is the agent of God one way or another. And of course, many theologians are taking an incredibly cynical description from him. Indeed, if you referenced Maccabees earlier, if you really sort of get into Maccabees, of course, the Hellenized structures of the Diadochi in particular, this is actually targeting Antiochus IV, one of the later Seleucid rulers who had attempted again to abandon the more sort of native practices of religion, such as the great sort of cults of Babylon, and impose more sort of Hellenistic practices. This makes him into the great antagonist for the Jews in the book of Maccabees. And here he's associated as essentially the arrival of the Antichrist. So Alexander, you can say, is both the divine agent of God in terms of being able to defeat the Persians, yet he could also be said again to be this great figure who is confounding the aspirations of the Jews on the one hand, if it's ultimately his successor in the form of Antiochus IV who's achieving this. But before we sort of leave this conversation on Alexander in Scripture, which is, should be mentioned, rather scant, the interpretation again is really what matters in terms of building this into a theology of Alexander. It's just a talk on the issue of temporality. You mentioned the year 776 earlier. The reason the year 776 is significant is because of the unique Greek system of dating. The Greeks had a conception of time which was based on the Olympiads, i.e. the 4 years between the Olympic Games. And of course, the Olympic Games had a far more significant religious and cult aspect to them compared to the modern revival of the Olympic Games at the end of the 19th century. And so when Alexander died, it was held, I believe, in the 113th Olympiad. If you look at the Egyptian dating system, it's very much around the years of the ruler, the anniversary of the ruler, and indeed in terms of looking at this as a dynastic dating system. So when the Ptolemies come in, they're the ones formalizing the histories of the great 30 dynasties that preceded them. However, when the Seleucids come along, they establish a progressive, linear form of time that begins in the year 312 BC, which is the entry of Seleucus into the city of Babylon. Why I find this very significant is because I would say in many ways it prefigures the idea of Anno Domini in a way that the Olympiads in Greece and that the Egyptian conception of dynastic time simply did not. And one of the sort of remarkable legacies of SE, Seleucid time, beginning in 312 BC, is it's often known synonymously as the Anno Graecorum, the year of the Greeks. In some sources, it's actually known as the year of Alexander. But if you're trying to backdate this, it's not Alexander the Great, who is Alexander III of Macedon. It's actually Alexander IV in the year of his son. So it's actually a misconstruing of what that actually meant. But what I found fascinating about this is that this dating system, SE, is in many cases actually used concurrently with AD. So in some of the Syriac and Nestorian churches, especially the churches in the East, they were using it in terms of inscriptions all the way up until the 15th century. The reason it was actually ended was partly as a result of the conquests of Tamerlane, who destroyed so much of the legacy and the history of the region of Central Asia and Persia during that time. But of course, when the rabbinic Jews, after the destruction of the Second Temple, when they wanted a dating system, when the empire converted to Christianity, of course, they didn't want to use Anno Domini because they rejected the Christ. They used the SE, they used the Seleucid era system. So again, another sort of interesting note of progression in terms of Alexander to Byzantium is actually the whole conception of linear time based on the origin of a divine founder. In the case of the Seleucids, it wasn't actually Seleucus himself, but it was Zeus apportioning him as the ruler of Earth and the successor of Alexander. So in many ways, you can say the new dating system actually begins with Alexander and his successors. It's a weird sort of thing I sort of noticed, sort of looking too far into this, but I found it fascinating to sort of consider.
If you were expecting me to contribute to what you said, I mean, I have nothing. It's really fascinating. I was actually taking notes because I never really thought about the dating systems. I didn't even read about it, but it's really fascinating because that plays a really important role. I'm sorry if I lost track of it, but I don't know if you mentioned the event when Alexander reaches the gates of Jerusalem after conquering Gaza, after Gaza falls, after Egypt, and he is not welcome, but he's met by the priest Jaddua. That is according to Josephus. I don't know if that was used as it could be in a way used as like a symbol or prefiguration of the Byzantine Vasileos, because I don't know, like what you think. It sounds almost like a legend. It could have been the real event, but Alexander did not attack Jerusalem. Everybody was afraid because it was this like tornado coming from Elas and destroying everything. And then the Jews were very scared. And then the priest Jaddua, which is very interesting, exactly like Melchizedek in the Old Testament, outside the gates of Jerusalem or Salem at the time, he meets with Abraham in a very similar fashion. And Abraham in that context is also a very successful warrior. After great victory, he's met by the high priest. And so is also in this circumstance with Alexander. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Parmenion asked Alexander, why is he not pursuing his conquest? And he said that he had a dream. He dreamt of the Jewish priest appearing in front of him, and that the Jewish priest was serving the one true God. This could be true, but it's also like an interesting symbol of like the later Byzantine Basileon who acknowledged a higher authority, like the eternal God.
Well, obviously, I'm going to be referencing this later. It's the prefiguring of the Milvian Bridge incident. But as I was alluding to Josephus earlier, and as I was alluding to the theological accounts, in particular Augustine and his lack of sympathy towards the account, which he reduces it even further to a pure act of vanity other than political utility. It all depends on the veracity of the dream. Because if Alexander really had that dream, and if he believed that his legacy was going to be bound up inexorably with this, strange little Jewish cult which he was faced with in Jerusalem, if that were really the case, I think he would have actually elevated their cult more, not so much associated his legacy with Zeus Ammon, and of course with his cult really being in Egypt. Another note of distinction between Alexander and his legacy sort of spread across the realms of the successors, the Diadochi, is the fact that politically, if you're going to look at Alexander as making himself a god and then inserting himself into the divine pantheon like the Roman imperial cult, the cult of Alexander isn't as successful as the Roman imperial cult later is, because the Seleucids are very clear to bypass Alexander in many ways and say, no, we are the direct descendants of Zeus, as Alexander himself would claim. But in the case of Egypt, the whole Ptolemaic project was, well, Alexander is Zeus Ammon, so Alexander is the center of our pantheon. So Alexander's own religious settlement, you can say, actually had limitations in terms of him becoming more of an Egyptian god than a universal ruler. That's just sort of one interpretation you can read of this. Whereas had he been, again, more sincere, had this, dream that Josephus alludes to actually being real, I think, again, he would have perhaps found greater utility in terms of elevating the role of a figure such as Jehovah. But alas, that didn't really happen. All we can sort of say is that Jerusalem was not subject to the similar fate that we, say, for example, see with the city of Tyre. But this comes to a very important point, which is the transition from Homonoia to the idea of Christendom. And this, again, is why Koselleck is very significant in terms of being able to talk about this dichotomy of the Hellen and the barbarian, and seeing it transition into this distinction between the Christian and the heathen. Because, as you and I both alluded to, the whole issue of polytheism is that it's incredibly heterodox. There's a lot of local cults, local syncretisms. Of course, you have that in terms of Christian saint worship, of course, but obviously not to the same extent that you actually have religious cults abounding. And of course, one of the benefits of having a polytheistic religion is that in integrating all of these faiths together. And if you're going to say this is prefiguring Byzantium, you have to sort of look at it as a progression in stages. Well, Alexander's cult, the connection is drawn in the Romance, you can say post hoc, to Aeneas. Well, obviously, the cult of Aeneas is going to draw Caesar back to the cause of Venus and make Venus Genetrix, you can say, the great ancestor god of the new Roman imperial project. Alexander essentially did the same thing, but with a more localized thing, focusing much more on Egypt. It should be mentioned when the Romans come along, they also appropriate that idea by making themselves pharaohs, when of course the pharaoh is often a divine position as well. But with the advent of Christianity and the idea that there is no God but God, and you can't have, again, the Christian God mingling with all these other elements, is part of the reason why the Emperor Julian was sort of so perspicacious in terms of, okay, well, how am I going to destroy Christianity? Well, funny enough, you can sort of look at it as him doing the Alexander thing, but with the opposite intention. With Alexander, you can look at this as, prefiguring the Byzantine mold by trying to be conciliatory towards Jehovah. In the case of the Emperor Julian, who comes after Constantine, it should be mentioned, the Emperor Julian is elevating the Jews and trying to establish the third temple in order to destroy Christianity. So there are many interpretations you can bring into this, but of course, what is incontrovertible is that around the 3rd century, Christianity becomes a major political force in the empire, and in the 4th century, it becomes the predominant, not the exclusive religion of the emperors, which is a very fraught topic to get into. And this is coming back to Reinhart Koselleck. The entry of the Christians into the Mediterranean world history tended the former categorization of Hellen and barbarian inaccurate. Even when their sects were regarded as barbaric, Christians could not be comprehended in terms of the dualism Hellen-barbarian, for they recruited from both camps. Not only was the meaning of this traditional antithesis superseded by the new religion, but also the semantic structure of the counter-concepts coined by the Christians was a novel idea. Within the immediate expectations of these apostolic communities, there was at first no concept for Christians, who regarded themselves as incomparable with Romans, Hellenes, or Jews. Neither did the name heathen initially exist as a collective term for non-Christians. At first, use of available dualities or counter-concepts continued, although they were related in a different manner. The linguistic usage of the Pauline mission no longer included concepts of division and distinction, but rather collected concepts for all men to whom the gospel was directed. And here he's alluding to Timothy 1:2-4 and Romans 5:18. Thus, as far as the Jews were concerned, Paul divided men according to whether they were circumcised or uncircumcised, but to all of whom he appealed impartially, Galatians 2:7. From a Hellenic point of view, he distinguished between Greeks and barbarians, or between the wise and the unwise, to whom he was equally indebted, Romans 1:14. He used another formulation in gathering together humanity as Hellenes and Jews, in which rather than referring to Hellenes, he used the terms ethni, those coexisting with the Jewish people, eos. It was humanity in general that was continually the subject of address. Human differences were erased so that the way could be opened from Jewish Christians to heathen Christians. Jews and Hellenes are different addressees the mission, but they are not divided by the alternative that Christianity offers them. The real antithesis derived from true belief. For instance, when Paul initially considered internal divisions, distinguishing between believers and unbelievers in a heretical community, 1 Corinthians 14:22, where he goes a step further and introduces the separation as a criterion of true belief. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. Proper receptivity to the gospel of Christ constituted the basis upon which a negative series could be built, and which ultimately characterizes all unbelievers negatively. They are Eusebia or Attica, Romans 1:18, or Hellenes and Jews, all under sin, Romans 3:9. In the words of Karl Barth, whoever says mankind says unredeemed mankind. Hence, mediation is possible between the contrasting figures drawn from belief and traditional terminology. Paul went further, however, in the use of counter-concepts, which proved to be of assistance in the foundation of his mission through their comprehension of all humanity. He developed from them linguistic paradoxes, which were enriched by apocalyptic imagery. These paradoxes provided the outline for the claim of exclusivity, which later had an influence on the empirically founded antithesis of Christian and heathen. Paul consciously confronted the non-comparable so that the implausibly apparent might come through the negation of the empirical world. In Colossians 3:11 and Galatians 3:28, there is a general denial of the usual dualities, of all the counter-concepts that signify the totality of humanity through belief in Christ. One is neither Hellen nor barbarian, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian nor Scythian, free man nor servant, man nor woman. All positions and negations of humanity, people, order, race, and religion are transcended for those redeemed by Christ. Pauline negation is more radical than previously appeared possible. The linguistic antithesis of Christianity and all humanity is no longer asymmetrical. The denial of asymmetry accompanies it so that the certainty of salvation might be assured. Part of the reason it should be mentioned is not just my belief, but popular belief as to why Christianity was so potent a symbol in terms of being able to show missionary work in the earlier church. The contrast between all of humanity and the baptized is not more qualifiable after a fashion of formal categorical names. What happens instead is that the reference group is doubled. Every person should become a Christian if he wishes to evade the pattern of eternal damnation. The Pauline dualism here, of all humanity there, those saved by Christ, permits of only one solution, if the paradox is not to remain in place. The Christian, or more precisely he who lives in Christ, is the new man who has done away with the old. In this way it is possible to negatively confront the totality of previous humanity with the potential generality of a Christian humanity. For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then were all dead. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is the new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. 2 Corinthians 5:14. The Pauline negation is no longer organized spatially, but is predominantly temporal, i.e. referencing all of man living in time. By contrast with the Greek perspective on the past, which merely deduced the ruling contrast of Hellen and barbarian historically, temporal tension structures this Pauline antithesis itself. All the existing peoples, Hellenes, Ethni, Gentes, and so forth, who become defined in Christian perspectives as heathens, Gentiles, and Pagani. Pagani essentially sort of referring to rustic dwellers or not of the cities or the main religion, belong as such to the past. By virtue of the death of Christ, the future belongs to the Christians. The future bears the new world. It is the temporal implication that differentiates the Pauline dualism from those considered previously. The parties involved were, in principle, not reducible to territory, as was initially the case with Hellen and barbarian. The contrast was just as interpretable as a comparison, as which suggested by the antithesis of educated, uneducated, and was implied by a later form of Hellen and barbarian. By that he's referring to the horizontal notion of Hellen and barbarian which exist within the empire itself. If anything, what this is alluding to is that Alexander, as with Cyrus before him, Cyrus is responsible essentially for breaking down divisions and establishing one empire with horizontal relationship between all the nations, albeit under an Achaemenid ruler. Then the Greeks come in and they further establish this notion of Homonoia, integrating all of these subject peoples and mirroring and syncretizing the customs and religions. And then you add another revolution to that, which is Christianity, which is further eroding all of these previous distinctions, whereby essentially no longer is the whole notion of Hellen and barbarian really relevant as far as a Christian goes. And this, of course, would be entirely pertinent were we only talking about Christianity in the abstract. But of course, when we get to the 4th century, when we get to Eusebius, when we get to Constantine, the religious revolution that we have under Constantine is that the Roman Empire, the Graecified Roman Empire in the East, is harmonized and ultimately adopts and convokes the first church councils, the Nicene Creed, etc. And therefore, the temporal possession of Christianity becomes associated with the emperor who is now the vice-regent of Christ. Combined to that, the Hellenistic superstructures, the modes of education, the elite strata that's governing an entire sort of community of speakers and intellectuals in the East, and you have the groundwork laid for the Byzantine Empire. So on the one hand, the Pauline distinction, which Koselleck was outlining there, would seem to be eliminating all possible distinctions, social, religious, and societal, as in cultural distinctions between the peoples, ethnic distinctions between the peoples. But in the end, you attach this to, again, Augustine talks about the friction between the city of earth and the city of God. You attach this to the temporal project of Rome, Eastern Rome in particular, and it becomes bound up to the idea of Byzantium. There is a form of syncretism that's taking place, which means that the brand of Christianity that you receive is invariably the result of all of these traditions coming in a sequence. You can talk about Christianity as representing the new, but of course, if you're going to look at figures like Cyrus and Christianity as a religion with a series of anticipations, Gentile intercessors coming back, and you look at this whole idea of the conquest of Alexander be construed as a restoration of the older Greek communities. In many ways, again, that this is something which is entirely new, but something which is also adapting and harmonizing with history as a whole in terms of the Roman Empire, and in particular, the Greek inheritances and the elements which have integrated into the Roman Empire as a whole. But I've been speaking for a very long time. Roxandra, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Wow, this we're starting to talk about the grand interest of Christianity, and it's so much to be said here. I don't think I have any substantial additions, and I don't want to overlap with the things that you want to discuss from here on. I was thinking maybe. So one thing is important to note about Christianity. I think. Let's take the example of the Roman Empire. I mentioned in the beginning that the Hellenic Empire and also the Roman Empire, they had this imperialistic aspect, of course, that's self-explanatory, but also this soteriological aspect. For instance, the Romans, when they conquered, they also tried to destroy and annihilate cultures very often. and they would destroy the places of worship. And then the idea of civis Romanus, the Roman citizen, would be this kind of redemptive quality that you could aspire towards. And so this was quite, obviously this is terrible, but it's also one of the keys of success for the Roman Empire for its expansion. So it's quite destructive and also enforced its ideas and, let's say, ecclesia. But in Christianity, and to some extent Hellenism, if I look at Hellenism as kind of I mentioned Weltanschauung, and I'm sorry, I'm not saying this because I want to be pretentious. I just I have these German words in my thought, in my active memory right now. Worldview. They're quite abstract. They survive and even flourish in ruins, especially Christianity, because it's a belief that goes really deep into the human soul, of course. But we could call them, let's say, providential coincidences. The fact that a lot of the Hellenistic philosophy was very compatible with Christianity, because we have a lot of truth in it. We have logics, argumentation. The bases were already laid in the Hellenic paideia. And we have a lot of church fathers that talk about the importance of the Hellenic philosophy in the sense of like love of wisdom and the principles of logic and all these things that were already established as very important to prepare people for to understand the Bible and also to defend the Bible. And apologetics as well has a long history too. And this started even before Christianity. If we think about the example of Philo of Alexandria, I think he died in 6th century AD. So he was a scholar he was a Jewish scholar, and he's probably one of the first recorded to interpret the Old Testament and write commentaries using expressions and terminology from the Platonic school. And through him, the Jewish belief and scholarship managed to reach a wider audience, to the more educated class of the Hellenic world, specifically in Alexandria. And then there's a wonderful quote from Clement of Alexandria, who can probably be considered one of the first Christian philosophers in the classical sense. He said that truth is a river in which many streams flow from all sides. He was trying to promote, philosophy, traditional Greek philosophy, to Christians, because we have many verses in the Bible that the knowledge of God was revealed already to the nations in many ways. Of course, before the incarnation of Christ, we have Romans chapter 1, we have Ecclesiastes 3:11. The thought of eternity was already planted in the heart of man. So I think, of course, when we talk about these things, it was ordained by God that Christianity started in the Mediterranean basin and went outwards. And the main channel of communication was already laid all the way to the Far East through the Koine Greek, in which the Old Testament was, the New Testament was written, and the gospel was shared. So there's a lot of coherence in some way. So the soil was already prepared through good philosophy, I think, to receive the truth.
Relating this again back to Alexander in terms of the elements that I've been trying to bring up here and fusing them into the imperial church, is that as the whole concept of Christianity becomes temporalized within the Roman Empire, then the Roman Empire becomes synonymous with the idea of the Christian community of believers, which of course evolves into the whole notion of Christendom. So the idea of the Hellenes and the barbarians actually doesn't go away, as you would allude to in terms of the pure Pauline application of it, but due to the whole, you can say ultimately what would emerge as the Byzantine tradition, is that the heathens, and indeed if we're going to talk about the West and the Catholic and the Orthodox split, the heretics are going to be divided, out of the oikomony, or the governorship, or the dominion under the reign of the justly sort of appointed Christian vice-regency or sovereign. And of course, if you're going to look at Alexander and him establishing the gates of the Caspian, the nations beyond, the Scythians, Gog and Magog and whatever, basically creating this fortress mentality around Christianity is emblematic of the whole idea of Christendom and the other. And of course, as we see progressively in terms of the end of Byzantium itself, Byzantium is of course overcome by the great other, which from the point of Christendom was of course the Islamic empires and ultimately the Ottoman Empire. But another interesting idea is that the issue with Helen, even though Alexander's empire, as we've been mentioning, is taking these ideas of the proliferation of the Hellen, recontextualizing it, and integrating it into this whole notion of homonoia, the unity of mankind based on the universal ruler who is Alexander, is the idea that around the time of Theodosius, so this is really the first Christian ruler, because Constantine had elements of syncretism throughout the end of his reign. And the issue with Constantine's reign is that many of his successors weren't Nicene Christians. There were Arians or semi-Arians, or in the case of Julian, who was actually the last dynastic member of the House of Constantine. He was, of course, a pagan and attempted a serious restoration as
the apostate. Yeah.
Yes, as Eusebius, the usurper against Theodosius in the year 394, was also a pagan. Part of Theodosius's reconquest of Western East was destroying things like the cult of the Vestal Virgins in the city of Rome, and of course, in terms of going back to the Olympiads, the banning of the Olympic Games. Because Helen had become so associated with pagan, this idea also had to undergo an evolution. So in terms of arriving at Byzantium, and all of these things representing a translation, these ideas which are constantly being updated, recontextualized, translated into a new thing. Yes, we now have the distinction between Christendom and everyone else, everyone outside of the empire. And later, when we have the Holy Roman Empire and the proliferation of nations in Western Europe, outside broader Christendom or outside the Catholic Church. In the case of Alexander, the whole notion of Helen progresses into the Romaioi, the Christianized, Graecified Romans, the whole notion of, again, Christians becoming Romans and Romans being synonymous with the empire, and the empire being, again, Christ's vice-regency, actually makes the term Romaioi rather neutral as a label for Christians in the East to have, unlike Helen, which, again, if you're going to look at this from the mind of someone like Theodosius, banning the Olympic Games has specific pagan connotations. So the idea of Hellenism isn't destroyed so much as it's superseded. And interestingly enough, it finds its new expression in a Greek iteration of what it means to be Roman. Hence, what actually supersedes the notion of Helen is actually uniquely Byzantine. In what I referenced right at the early of the introduction of this stream, what is Byzantium? It is a Graecified, Orientalized Roman universal empire. That essentially is the creation of the Romaioi, the self-conception of a Christian Greek Roman that comes into the East and will endure in some form or another, even under the Ottoman Empire. Even under the Ottoman Empire, even though Constantinople is taken and the emperor is destroyed, the last one being Constantine XI, the millets or the nations will continue under Ottoman suzerainty and control up until the 19th century. So the legacy continues in one form or another. So the demarcation of Roman and Christian and of the Greek Orthodox kind being associated these words, it begins around the time of the 4th century AD, and it continues up really until the 19th century. I mean, one of my more controversial points in this channel is how I view the Greek War of Independence, among other things, in which my sort of great conceptual demarcation point is that the Greeks opted out of being Romaioi in order to become Hellenes once again. So, yeah, in terms of trying to conceive of a through line for Homonoia, it begins with the elimination of civil wars, of factional strife within a single Greek polity. It's later then expanded out to talk about all of the Greek kingdoms and polities. And then it's going to be expanded out to encompass the entire world, of which had all been Greek or had the potential to be Hellenized, either through education or whatever. In the same way that we talk about, I hate to use it in the same context because it's so divorced, but just to make, actually, no, I'm not going to use it because I think it's just going to cause more complications and headaches for everyone. And then, of course, the next evolution of that is we have the translation of this idea of paideia, or education, into catechesis and Christian education and proper religious formation, and ultimately, of course, of belief and belief in the one God and the Holy Trinity. And arriving at Byzantium at the end of it, if you look at it in terms of a certain sort of historical world thread, an element which is carrying through since the time of Alexander, it certainly exists. The last thing I'm going to talk about is actually by talking about Eusebius and Constantine and talking about the implications of Alexander's personality. But what would you have to say on, I guess, my interpretation there?
No, I think there's nothing that I could say to contradict, but I do agree, because it's, in a sense, it's a logical chain of events, and there's a lot of disputes, of course, like you mentioned the early stages of Christianity. There was so much, let's say, we talked about Homonoia, the opposite of it, the stasis, which is basically what you mentioned, the civil wars, disputes, strife, and the Roman Empire and also the Byzantine Empire never had a break from it. It was constantly something either inside or outside, but it was also like very deeply marked by this heterodox, constant debate and polemic regarding Christianity, because of course all the first councils in which the basic doctrines were decided upon, the Orthodox theology and so on, and then it was like an anti-Hellenic feel, and then there was a pro-Hellenic feel. I think of course you're going to mention Heraclius, because in many ways he's kind of you can see many parallels to Alexander the Great, and he also finishes something that he defeats the Persian Empire. It's kind of the last stage of Persian supremacy in the East there, and he's finishing something that Justinian probably could have done a little bit better, because I think this weakness in the East was not solved in the early stages. But I think you can never divorce, in my opinion, I think you can never divorce the Roman Empire from the Hellenic thought or the Hellenic spirit in many ways, because even the Roman pantheon is of Greek influence, and Romei, of course, it's an identity, but it's mostly like a political identity, a civilian identity. But I think most of the times at the court of the Roman Empire, most of them were probably Greeks, the vast majority of intellectuals. And there was also the ethnic distinction that is not really talked about because we don't have many sources, and it's very hard to talk about ethnicity in modern terms. But I wish I could remember exactly the year, because I know I've read somewhere about a letter written by this Greek from Constantinople. He was a doctor, and he sent a letter to one of his superiors, and his name is Michael Italicos, or Michael Italicos, and he sends this coin, apparently, which had apotropaic properties. So it was kind of a coin that you use to heal yourself, kind of a magic object. And on one side, it was the portrait of Constantine and Helen. And on the other side, it was the portrait of Christ. And in the letter, he mentions that the portrait of Christ has Roman features. So it's interesting that even though they were Romei from the east, they were Hellenized Romei probably, and they knew how to distinguish themselves, like even physically, from the Western counterparts. It's a very complex issue, and I mean, I think you're right. I just added this as an illustration of how far the discussion can go.
Well, I mean, just in terms of completing the conversation, I mean, we talk about the aspect of the morphology of Helen. But here I sort of want to finish off in terms of the last reading segment I have, which is by Rudolph Storch, which is the Eusebian Constantine, and trying to again see many elements of which, if Byzantium and Christianity is going to become an imperial structure, then we have to look at Alexander again as one of these great emperors anticipating this. The first aspect of the Eusebian Constantine entails emphasis on divine participation in imperial affairs like Alexander. The hand of God is present in all favorable aspects of Constantine's reign, as we see with the account of Josephus and the parting of the waves and luck being an integral component in order to legitimate Alexander, the references to providence, the fact that he goes into battle in the vanguard in order to chase Darius's chariot, etc. The wounds he suffers in the course of his Indian campaign. It should be noted that I think it was, I could be wrong, but an anecdote I might be misremembering about the Indian campaign is that he assaulted a city and realized upon besetting the walls that he was the only one to have actually climbed the ladder. And so he was surrounded and nearly killed and suffered an arrow wound. But that's the sort of Alexander we're talking about. Providence is on my side, and if not so, it'll be demonstrated by my horrific defeat. But the same logic essentially goes for the luck which divine affairs has afforded Constantine. In the opinion of Eusebius, the emperor used God's counsel as a source of guidance. Constantine is portrayed as being in intimate contact with God, who was his friend and protector. This, of course, coming from recollections on Eusebius's biography. It is in the sphere of military activity that Eusebius sees his God as being closest to Constantine. It began in 312, interesting year in terms of a completely weird connection, but just SE beginning in BC. But anyway, when Constantine so earnestly sought divine aid, received it at Milvian Bridge, and continuously thereafter against the barbarians and his adversary, Licinius. Crucial to the success of Constantine as a ruler was God's help in a continuous course of conquest, rendering him unsubdued and invincible, an emperor of the race of tyrants and all mankind. Eusebius's view of the final encounter with Licinius, with all of its confirmation of the divine allegiance found in 312, was that Constantine had a divine ally who fought at his side, forcing Licinius to war against God himself. Once Eusebius had betrayed Constantine as being close to his God, who would intervene in imperial affairs, he had to show that the emperor was pious, worthy of divine favor, since God is the defender of the pious. Eusebius, through constant reference to the pietas of the emperor, makes the image of the pious Constantius dominate the vita. Constantine had every virtue of piety which guided his actions. During the Arian controversy, he wept for a pious concern and filled the role of a pious emperor promoting peace in the church. Godly fear and piety distinguished Constantine as he entered the assembly hall at Nicaea. The emperor's letter to the churches following the council was written so his pure sincerity of thought and piety to God might be discerned. Eusebius saw Constantine continually make progress in this direction of piety and felt that others recognized the emperor as an instructor in the practice of pietas. This, again, to reference the friction that we see with the various theological and indeed Christian accounts that we see regarding Alexander in terms of how to reconcile the more onerous aspects of Alexander's personality, and as with Josephus, try to represent his Greek virtues, his magnanimous nature, and him being, again, seen as part of this great pantheon of anticipations of the Christian empire. And if you again read that, you can substitute much of the language and refer to Alexander and see it as an Alexander hagiography, because in many ways, that's the whole point I'm essentially getting at, is that Alexander albeit from a pre-Christian sense, is configuring the imperial Byzantine archetype. I'm aware, Ruxandra, that you need to go soon. I think the only thing that can really be mentioned here is obviously the foundation of the city, which, of course, in terms of linking this back to Byzantium, I go back to the point I brought up right at the earlier. One of the key aspects of the inscription of Alexander and his legitimation, the founder of a city of incomparable stature. Of course, for Alexander, it was Alexandria. For Seleucus, it was and his heirs, it was ultimately Antioch on the Orontes. And of course, for Constantine, it was Constantinople. All of these cities featured prominently in the Pentarchy. And together, you can say, were a huge amount in terms of informing the episcopal and political structure of the Eastern Christian Mediterranean. I was probably just going to go on and talk about other potential claimants, I guess, for the evolution of the Byzantine ideal. You mentioned earlier Heraclius, but I understand if you need to go, we can skip that.
No, I would like to apologize to everybody listening. I'll have to go soon, and I don't know if I have something to add. I assume that's what you asked me last minute. But yeah, so even Constantinople, I mean, we emphasized before, and probably it's not necessary that I insist, because the Byzantine Empire, we use it, it's a modern term, but the term Byzantium comes from a Megaran colony, so it's a Greek colony on where Constantinople was built, and Constantinople comes from the Emperor Constantine. So that's where the capital was inaugurated in 330. So we have, in that regard, also like a Greek Hellenic continuity. The Hellenic intellect, as I said, is kind of a continuum through time, and it's preserved and flourishes through Christian metaphysics, of course. And then, yeah, before I leave, I wanted to talk about Heraclius, because I think he's probably one of the most important figures to mention, because it was during his reign. He was not only an illustrious leader in a time of great need during a time of crisis, but he also reinstituted the term Basileus, which kind of replaced the term, I think, imperator, or Caesar, Caesar, and the term was still used, was still in use in many different parts of the world. Of course, the Hellenic world, referring to leaders, it was used. For the king of Persia, I think by Greeks, it was very, they only used it in very specific situations. And I mentioned that because Basileon is the term probably coined by Alexander the Great, because he was the emperor, the Basileon, the anointed one in the Greek terminology. And during Heraclius, the Greek language became the official state language. So that's when the Roman Empire morphed into an actual Greek empire, but still, legalistically speaking, or legally speaking, it was still a Roman Empire by inheritance. So he would have kind of fulfilled, he would have closed the circle of Hellenic influence, going through the Roman Latin phase and then being concluded in the East back into the Hellenic phase, which was more of a natural, organic act, because Greek was probably the most important language in the empire. Of course, also during Justinian's reign, Greek was probably the most spoken and influential language in the empire, but still the administrative official language was Latin for many centuries. So I think if you were to compare a Roman emperor to Alexander, I would go back to Heraclius, I think.
Well, my final point before I let you go is just another sort of added irony to that, is that if Alexander the Great is responsible for inaugurating this idea, you can say, of the pre-Romaeo East, Heraclius is responsible for enshrining it in Roman law, but he's also responsible for its demise in part because of its failure to deal with the Arab conquest. So whatever Byzantine sort of remnant is going forward is going to lose those core elements of the Alexandrian conquest and the successor states, which of course is Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria. But
It's a very
thank
sad
you.
period because it's a very sad period because he managed to completely defeat the Persian enemy, but then the Arab enemy kind of gained in power afterwards. So yeah, you're right. And also the Eastern Empire or the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages was called Romania. The citizens always saw themselves as, I think the Greek pronunciation is Romei. And so yeah, that's just about it. And thank you very much for having me. It was wonderful listening to you. I took a lot of notes. I didn't have any substantial contributions, but I really applaud you for this idea. And yeah, I will continue to listen. Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure, and it's been wonderful to have you, and I'm sure the audience has really appreciated your contributions as well, which haven't been insubstantial by any means whatsoever. And thank you to you and everyone else for trying to fathom what I'm talking about this entire time. So thank you again, and hope to have you on soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Right, I'll go through the super chats and try and ask any questions. Now you have me on all to yourself. Rong Tao Wu for $10, thank you. AM just has to bring me back to live with Rux, Alexander, and Byzantium. Have to stay awake all night to finish my paperwork just to enjoy this. Glad to have you both on. Hi, Ruxandra. Well, thank you very much, Rong Tao Wu, and I'm sure she appreciates that as well. Alice is doomed, gifts 5 AM memberships. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure what that means, but that's very much appreciated. Thank you. Rong Tao Wu again for $5. Serapis is interested because Ptolemy claimed to have founded Serapis from the Trabuzonite, another Byzantine connection. Well, the Serapis connection actually comes back to the city of Sinope in Pontus, if I believe. You can see that as a broader political connection. I mean, one interpretation in terms of reifying that idea of linking this back to Pontus is actually finding a way to create a second front against the Seleucids in Asia Minor. But yes, the Sinope connection is very well attested to there with Serapis. Rong Tao Wu again, gifts 1 membership again. Thank you very much. Also reclaiming the Persid Argead line. I'm not sure what that's in particular reference. If you're referencing the Ptolemies and the Argeads, yeah, Ptolemy directly wanted the empire to be linked with the legacy of Alexander, in the way that the Seleucids, in many ways, try to not bypass the legacy of Alexander, but de-emphasize it somewhat in terms of their grand sort of political iconography. Aaron Fire 359 for $10. Thank you very much. I'm unable to watch this live, but I'm looking forward to watching this in full later on. Thank you for making these interesting and unique videos. Well, thank you very much, Aaron Fire. For $10, Easterly Westerner for $20. I couldn't drop in for long, but I wanted to thank you. Lately, you've been putting out a wealth of outstanding work that I can find through lines tying them all together, although they may be on this and that. That's your hallmark. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Easterly Westerner. My point I think I made when I was talking about Guelphs and Ghibellines, the defense of a worldview, is that I do try, at least intellectually, to see these as all a part of a series of interconnected strands, because of course, you know, that's how historical sort of mental formations work. And of course, why I find Alexander and Homonoia particularly interesting is, as we went through is about breaking down a whole conception of an ethnic identity and recontextualizing it over and over and over again, to the point where you have the parochial anti-barbarian Greek city-state embracing the idea of the Christian unity of mankind. One would seem to be completely opposite from one another, but Alexander is crucial in terms of presenting a through line to all of these things, in terms of representing a civilizational and intellectual evolution. And you can draw this to many points. I mean, one thing for this conversation I had to sort of trim down were actually connections to theologians in the West. So talking about French and German and Italian theological studies on Alexander from like the 13th century onwards. The reason being, of course, is that this is a Byzantium study. So instead, the focus has been on earlier figures, the Church Fathers, Eusebius, and in the Byzantine manuscripts, such as the Greek Romance. Less so Western theologians, but the more you think about it, the more you can take this and apply it very liberally. Dimitri Garlick for $20. Thank you very much. An excellent stream. Alexander does seem to form the archetype of universal monarch in the Greek East, was seen as much in the Western Holy Roman Empire or in the Muslim East, Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottomans. Yeah, as going back to the whole idea of the Alexander Schlacht in Altorfer, Alexander was not just heralding a universal monarchy in the Greek East, but he was the universal monarch. The Greek Empire, Alexander / the Seleucid Empire, was one of the empires in the prophecy of Daniel, representing universal dominion over the world. And of course, the empire that wins that contest before Christianity, of course, is the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire then subsequently becomes Christianized. So that was very much the conventional view. The nuance comes in as to whether you see Alexander as having agency in that role, other than being an unwitting actor for God. I mean, coming back to Eusebius's interpretation here of having Constantine by necessity being a pious man, of course, that's ignoring the many wars he had to fight and the horrific family strifes he went through, and the implications of his various crimes. That and the rather primitive idea around Constantine that the reason he delayed his baptism for so long was that he could only be cleansed of his sins once his political crimes had basically reached a point where he could commit no more. And when you look at the sort of commingling of heterodox sects and the Arians and the House of Constantine, it makes it even more nebulous. But the point is that for someone like Alexander, there are, of course, obviously apologetics in history in trying to present Alexander as this precursor to Christ. However, you have someone like Orosius in his apologetic history of Christianity. What Orosius is trying to achieve essentially is something that Augustine of Hippo at the same time is trying to deal with, which is this notion that the empire is failing and Christianity is the result of it, which is the accusation being hurled around. And so the Christians basically have to defend themselves and understand the idea of temporal defeat within a broader spiritual spectrum. For Orosius, this essentially meant that Alexander was a profligate and a vainglorious figure, as he was, and should be mentioned, St. Augustine. So it's possible to interpret Alexander as being both this spectacular sort of semi-mythological character, conquering the world's greatest empire of that time and redefining an entire civilization and ending another. But also you can define him as this narcissistic, hubristic tyrant. I mean, when I was reading out the segments of his war on the impossible and his attempts basically of getting into heaven, the very obvious implication is that Alexander was transcending, you can say, the limits of temporal existence and trying to aspire to be a god in his own right. That is evident from the cult of Alexander and his appropriation as Zeus Ammon. He wanted to be incorporated into the whole sort of spectre of the divines. And of course, that's where the Greek idea of hubris comes in. It's all very interesting in many ways. You can read Alexander's character. However, if you're going to look at him as this passive receptacle, an unwitting agent in the Christian idea of the Gentile intervention in history, like with Cyrus, then his character becomes a less significant point, theologically speaking. As for the Umayyads, Abbasids, and the Ottomans, yes, they all kept alive the legacy of Alexander. I mentioned the Greek Romance and its proliferation into Christian Byzantine culture, but of course the romances were translated and proliferated widely in the Islamic East. And of course various Ottoman rulers such as Suleiman the Magnificent, whilst also viewing themselves sometimes as the successors of the Roman Empire, also looked at themselves as the successors of Alexander the Great. So his legacy, you could say quite rightly, if we're going to look at this very generalized idea of Byzantium, was also appropriated by the Muslims and appropriated by the Ottomans and the lands which ultimately used to encompass much of his domain. I mean, for the Egyptians, the issue is the most sort of obvious, because Alexander was seen as restoring Egyptian independence. And so even today, in modern Egypt, like the Ptolemies, Alexander occupies this prided place despite being Greek. Ambivalent teacher for $7 Canadian, thank you. Missed part of the streams. I do not know if I missed this, but was there any attempt by the Byzantians to treat Alexander the way Old Testament did Cyrus as a proto-Messiah? Yes, exactly. That is the interpretation, that he was another Cyrus type figure. The main difference between Cyrus and Alexander is his rather nebulous stance on the Jews. What Josephus tries to do is Josephus tries to put Alexander in a tradition of Cyrus, whereby he was I hate to use the word Philo-Semite because it's anachronistic to this period, but a friend to the Jews, in the way that Cyrus had, quote unquote, liberated the Jews from their Babylonian captivity, albeit again it proliferated wildly in Christian apologetics about Alexander, but it wasn't so concrete an example. And then, of course, you have the issue of the Maccabean revolts being directed against Hellenism and being directed against Antiochus. And you see that Alexander's legacy with the Jews is very complicated. It basically, are you going to take St. Augustine's interpretation, or are you going to take Josephus's interpretation? There was clearly a desire among some Jews to position Alexander as a successor in the mode of Cyrus. All right. As that is the end of the super chats, all I'm going to say is that Roxandra didn't have an opportunity before she had to rush out, unfortunately. But just to say, thank you once again very much to Roxandra for joining me for this discussion this evening. I just want to point out that she has a website, Classical Odyssey. She does wonderful illustrations. She is currently in terms of the process of finishing a series of illustration for a series of biographies regarding Alexander, in addition to various other works, like a fully illustrated copy of Plutarch's Lives. You can find her on her website. You can also find her on Twitter, X. Yes, ambivalent teacher. Yes, thank you for your answer regarding the Jews' consideration. There are so many different interpretations of Alexander. I'm sure we've covered most of them, hopefully, this evening. But the most relevant argument, the crux of this argument, was the translation of Homonoia into Christendom. That for Byzantium should be the core element getting to. It's very obvious if you're not really invested in conceptual history, and you're not looking at worldviews of certain civilizations, you can just look at the superficial aspects, such as the the use of language and semantics and the Greek aspect of Alexander and say that that's the most important. But I think by far the most important aspect that weds Alexander the Great inextricably to Byzantium is the idea of Homonoia into Christendom, and him being in anticipation as the Christian emperor going from Diocletian's master and god to the vice regency of Christ, as we see with the figure of Constantine, albeit it's a progress that goes way beyond Constantine, as Ruxandra mentioned, with Heraclius. I already alluded to Theodosius, Justinian, Heraclius, but it continues. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, when we arrive at Byzantium as a term which is far more useful, looking at someone like Irene is very useful, because Byzantium becomes orientalized from the West. And that another is an aspect of the sort of meta commentary here, is that Alexander the Great, yes, he has his Roman connection, but he is ultimately the hero of the Hellenized East. And Byzantium, the Romans ultimately, you can say, become conquered by Alexander's legacy. That's one way of interpreting it. All right. Thank you very much for everyone for watching, and good night.